Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey through the shadows of the American frontier. Tonight, we'll unravel the complete tale of the Blackwater massacre, that fateful heist that marked the beginning of the end for Dutch van der Linde's gang of outlaws. This is a story of ambition and betrayal, of dreams shattered by greed, and of how a single robbery would echo through the years like thunder across the plains. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we ride together through this tale of the Old West. There's no rush here, just let the story carry you away like dust on the evening wind. In the distant reaches of the American frontier, where the vast expanse of wilderness stretched beyond the horizon like an ocean of grass and stone, there existed a brotherhood of outlaws whose very name would become legend, whispered around campfires and spoken in hushed tones in the saloons of dusty frontier towns. This was the Van der Linde gang, a collection of souls bound together not merely by their shared life outside the law, but by something far more precious and rare, a genuine belief that they could carve out their own version of freedom in a world that seemed determined to crush the dreams of those who dared to live by their own rules. The man who had forged this unlikely family from the raw material of society's outcasts was Dutch van der Linde himself, a figure whose charisma and silver tongue could charm the birds from the trees or convince a preacher to rob his own church. Dutch was not merely the leader of this gang, but its philosopher, its visionary, and in many ways, its heart and soul. He possessed that rare quality of being able to see the nobility in even the most desperate circumstances, transforming common thieves and cutthroats into something approaching knights of the wilderness, bound by codes of honor that most civilized men had long since forgotten. Dutch's vision was both simple and revolutionary in its implications. He believed that civilization, with all its laws and restrictions, its class divisions, and its endless grinding machinery of commerce and industry, was fundamentally corrupt and corrupting. The cities that were springing up across America like mushrooms after rain were not symbols of progress, but monuments to human greed and the death of individual freedom. In Dutch's philosophy, the only honest way to live was outside this system entirely, taking what was needed from those who had gained their wealth through the exploitation of others, and using that freedom to create something better, something more authentic than what the so-called respectable world had to offer. This was not mere banditry in Dutch's mind, but a form of rebellion against a world that had lost its way, a rejection of the values that placed profit above humanity and order above justice. When the gang robbed a train carrying the payroll of some distant corporation, they were not simply stealing money, but striking a blow against a system that enriched the few at the expense of the many. When they took supplies from the wagons of wealthy merchants, they were redistributing resources that had been accumulated through what Dutch saw as fundamentally unjust means. The core of this philosophy was embodied in the relationship between Dutch and his oldest friend and partner, Hosea Matthews, a man whose wisdom and experience served as both anchor and compass for the gang's moral navigation. Where Dutch provided the inspiration and the grand vision, Hosea offered the practical wisdom and the gentle guidance that kept their activities from descending into mere brutality. The two men had known each other for so long that their partnership had evolved into something that resembled a marriage more than a simple criminal alliance, each one's strengths complementing the other's weaknesses, in ways that made them far more formidable together than either could have been alone. Hosea Matthews was everything that Dutch was not, quiet where Dutch was eloquent, cautious where Dutch was bold, practical where Dutch was philosophical. Yet there was never any question about his loyalty to their shared cause, or his belief in the essential rightness of what they were trying to accomplish. Hosea had lived long enough to see the world change in ways that confirmed Dutch's darkest predictions about the direction of American society, and his support for their way of life came not from youthful romanticism, but from hard-won experience of what the alternatives actually looked like. Between these two pillars of leadership stood Arthur Morgan, a man who had grown from a wild young orphan into something approaching the gang's conscience. Though he would have been the first to laugh at such a description, Arthur had been with Dutch and Hosea since he was barely more than a boy, found by them in circumstances that had stripped away whatever illusions he might have had about the kindness of the civilized world. Under their guidance, he had developed into a man whose loyalty was absolute, and whose competence in the various dark arts required by their profession was matched by very few. Arthur was the gang's enforcer, their most skilled gunfighter, and often their voice of practical reason when Dutch's philosophical inclinations threatened to lead them into situations that even outlaws should avoid. He possessed a natural intelligence that formal education had never touched, but that life on the trail had honed to a razor's edge, allowing him to read situations and people with an accuracy that often surprised those who mistook his quiet demeanor for simple-mindedness. More than that, Arthur had developed a moral compass that, while it might not point in the same direction as that of respectable society, was nonetheless unwavering in its commitment to protecting those he considered family. The gang that had grown up around these three central figures was unlike any other criminal organization operating on the American frontier. Rather than being held together by fear or simple greed, they functioned more like an extended family, complete with all the complex relationships, loyal bonds, and occasional petty disputes that such arrangements inevitably entailed. Each member had been carefully chosen not merely for their skills but for their character, their ability to live according to the unwritten codes that governed life within the group, and their commitment to the shared vision that made their dangerous lifestyle feel like something more than mere survival. John Marston represented the younger generation within this family, a man whose wild youth and impulsive nature often put him at odds with the more experienced members, but whose fundamental decency and courage had earned him a place at the inner circle of Dutch's trust. John's journey from reckless young hothead to reliable member of the gang had been marked by numerous mistakes and setbacks, but it had also demonstrated the transformative power of belonging to something larger than oneself, of being held to standards that demanded growth and maturity, rather than simply tolerating whatever behavior was convenient. The bond between John and Arthur was particularly complex, mixing elements of brotherhood, rivalry, and genuine affection in ways that reflected the broader dynamics within the gang as a whole. Arthur had watched John grow up within the group, had been present for his worst mistakes and his greatest triumphs, and had developed the kind of protective instinct toward the younger man that an older brother might feel toward a sibling who never quite seemed to learn from experience. This sense of family extended throughout the gang's membership, creating relationships that transcended the simple criminal partnerships that characterized most outlaw bands. Charles Smith, a man of mixed Native American and African heritage, who had found in the gang the acceptance that mainstream society had always denied him, brought skills in tracking and hunting that were essential to their survival, along with a quiet dignity that commanded respect from even the most prejudiced members of their group. Javier Escuela had fled to the gang from Mexico, carrying with him stories of revolution and oppression that resonated strongly with Dutch's philosophy, while contributing his own expertise in the arts of guerrilla warfare and his remarkable skill with both guitar and gun. His presence served as a reminder that their struggle was part of something larger than American frontier crime, connected to movements for freedom and justice that were occurring throughout the Americas. Bill Williamson represented the kind of man that civilization often discarded without thought, a former soldier whose service to his country had earned him nothing but contempt and poverty, whose natural talents had been ignored by a society that saw only his rough exterior and working-class origins. In the gang, Bill found not only acceptance but genuine appreciation for his military experience and his unshakable loyalty to those who had shown him kindness when the rest of the world had turned its back. The women of the gang occupied positions of respect and authority that would have been unthinkable in most areas of 19th century American society. Susan Grimshaw ran the camp with an iron fist and a mother's heart, ensuring that domestic arrangements functioned smoothly while providing the kind of emotional stability that allowed dangerous men to maintain their humanity. Abigail Roberts, John Marston's partner and the mother of young Jack, represented hope for the future, while also serving as a constant reminder of what they were all fighting to protect and preserve. Perhaps most remarkable of all was the way the gang had managed to create a functioning society that operated according to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility while remaining effective as a criminal organization. Money earned through their various illegal activities was shared according to need rather than contribution, ensuring that everyone was fed and clothed and equipped for whatever challenges they might face. Decisions about major operations were made collectively, with Dutch serving more as a chairman than a dictator, guiding discussions rather than simply imposing his will. This democratic approach to leadership was particularly evident in their approach to selecting targets and planning operations. While Dutch's philosophical framework provided the broad outlines of what kinds of activities were acceptable, the specific details were worked out through extensive consultation with all the gang members who would be involved. Arthur's practical experience, Hosea's wisdom, John's local knowledge, and the specialized skills of other members all played important roles in determining how their ideals would be translated into action. The gang's reputation throughout the frontier was complex and multifaceted, reflecting the contradictory nature of their position in society. To the wealthy and powerful, they were dangerous criminals whose activities threatened the established order and the smooth functioning of commerce and industry. Railroad barons and bank owners had placed substantial bounties on their heads, while newspaper editorials regularly condemned them as threats to civilization and progress. Yet, among the common people of the frontier, their reputation was far more nuanced and generally more positive. Stories circulated of the gang's generosity to those in need, their protection of communities threatened by other criminal groups, and their adherence to codes of conduct that prevented them from harming innocent people or engaging in the kinds of senseless violence that characterized many outlaw bands. Children in farming communities would sometimes play games based on romanticized versions of the gang's exploits, while their parents grudgingly admitted that Dutch's boys were at least better than the alternatives. This reputation for relative decency was not accidental, but reflected the careful attention that Dutch and his lieutenants paid to maintaining their image and, more importantly, to living up to the standards they had set for themselves. They made a point of avoiding unnecessary violence, of protecting women and children, of sharing their gains with those who had less. When they robbed a train, they took money from the railroad company and wealthy passengers, but often left working-class travelers untouched, or even gave them small amounts to help with their journeys. Such behavior was not merely good public relations, but reflected genuine moral commitments that were central to the gang's identity and self-understanding. They were not common criminals, but representatives of an alternative way of living, demonstrators of the possibility that society could be organized according to different principles than those that dominated the rapidly industrializing United States. The daily life of the gang reflected these values in countless small ways that distinguished them from other criminal organizations. Their camps were organized with careful attention to cleanliness and order, with specific areas designated for different activities and clear expectations about everyone's responsibilities for maintaining their shared living space. Meals were communal affairs that reinforced social bonds while providing opportunities for planning and information sharing. Education and cultural activities were valued and encouraged, with gang members sharing their knowledge and skills with others who wanted to learn. Dutch himself was widely read and encouraged intellectual discussion, while other members contributed their own areas of expertise, whether that involved teaching, guitar playing, sharing hunting techniques, or passing on the practical skills needed for various types of criminal activity. The gang's relationship with the law was complex and constantly evolving as they moved through different territories with different enforcement practices and different levels of corruption among local officials. They had learned to read the signs that indicated whether a particular area was safe for their activities or whether they needed to move on quickly to avoid confrontation with authorities who might be more competent or more honest than average. This constant movement was both a necessity and a choice, reflecting their rejection of settled life, while also providing the practical advantage of staying ahead of pursuit. They had developed an almost nomadic lifestyle that allowed them to take advantage of opportunities as they arose, while avoiding the kind of routine that would make them easy targets for law enforcement or rival criminal groups. Yet for all their skill at avoiding capture, the gang was increasingly aware that the world around them was changing in ways that made their lifestyle more difficult and dangerous with each passing year. The frontier that had provided them with refuge and opportunity was steadily shrinking as railroads pushed into previously inaccessible areas and telegraph lines brought distant law enforcement agencies into coordination with local authorities. More fundamentally, the economic and social changes that Dutch had identified as threats to individual freedom were accelerating at a pace that sometimes left even the gang's leadership struggling to adapt. Industrial capitalism was transforming not only the cities but the countryside as well, creating new forms of wealth and power that operated according to rules that were still being written. The Pinkerton Detective Agency represented the most visible and immediate threat posed by these changes. Unlike local sheriffs who might be corrupted, intimidated, or simply outgunned, the Pinkertons operated as a private army in service to corporate interests, with resources and capabilities that far exceeded anything the gang had previously encountered. They were professional, persistent, and well-funded, representing a type of opposition that required entirely new strategies and tactics. As the 1890s progressed and the new century approached, it became increasingly clear that the gang's golden years were drawing to a close, though few of its members were prepared to acknowledge this reality directly. The easy scores that had sustained them were becoming more difficult to find, while the consequences of being caught were becoming more severe. The romantic vision of outlaw life that had sustained them through years of hardship and danger was running up against practical realities that no amount of philosophical commitment could overcome. Dutch himself seemed to sense these changes more acutely than anyone else, though his responses to them were often contradictory and sometimes counterproductive. On one hand, he spoke more frequently about finding a way to retire from criminal activity, perhaps establishing a ranch or farm somewhere beyond the reach of their enemies where the gang could live quietly and peacefully. On the other hand, he also spoke of increasingly ambitious schemes that would provide them with enough money to buy their way out of their current difficulties. This tension between the desire for peace and the need for one more big score would ultimately prove to be the gang's undoing, though in early 1899, as they prepared for what would become known as the Blackwater Massacre, such an outcome still seemed both distant and avoidable. They remained confident in their abilities, united in their loyalty, and committed to the vision that had sustained them through so many previous challenges. The bonds that held them together had been forged through years of shared hardship and mutual dependence, tested by countless dangers, and strengthened by numerous triumphs. They were more than simply a criminal gang. They were a family, a community, and a living demonstration of the possibility that people could organize their lives according to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility, rather than the competitive individualism that dominated mainstream American society. In the autumn of 1898, when the leaves had turned to gold and crimson across the high country of the northern Grizzlies, fate would introduce Dutch van der Linde to a man whose presence would alter the very soul of his gang in ways that none of them could foresee at the time. The meeting occurred in the rough mining town of Crenshaw Hills, a place that existed on the very edge of civilization, where desperate men came to scratch fortunes from the unforgiving earth or die in the attempt, and where the normal rules of society held about as much sway as morning mist before the rising Sunday. Dutch had come to Crenshaw Hills on what should have been routine business for a man of his profession: the sale of gold that the gang had recently liberated from a mining operation whose owners had grown wealthy on the backs of immigrant workers paid starvation wages. The transaction was meant to be straightforward enough, a simple exchange of stolen precious metal for cash that could sustain the gang through the coming winter months. But the frontier had a way of turning even the simplest plans into complicated affairs that tested both nerve and judgment. The buyer Dutch had arranged to meet was a local merchant who had built a reputation for asking few questions about the origins of the goods he purchased, a quality that made him invaluable to men who operated outside the boundaries of legitimate commerce. Yet when Dutch arrived at the appointed meeting place, a dimly lit saloon that reeked of stale beer and unwashed bodies, he found himself walking into a situation that had deteriorated far beyond his ability to control through charm or intimidation alone. The merchant, it seemed, had developed doubts about the wisdom of conducting business with Dutch van der Linde, perhaps influenced by the growing bounties on the gang leader's head, or simply by the kind of cold feet that often struck otherwise reliable criminal contacts when they were actually faced with the reality of what they were doing. Rather than conducting the transaction as agreed, he had brought with him several associates whose manner and weaponry suggested they were more interested in claiming the reward for Dutch's capture than in completing any business arrangement. What followed was the kind of tense standoff that had become all too familiar to Dutch over the years, a delicate dance of words and implied threats, where the slightest miscalculation could lead to violence that would benefit no one except perhaps the undertaker. Dutch found himself outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a room full of hostile men who saw him not as a person but as a walking bundle of reward money, while outside the winter, wind howled through the streets of Crenshaw Hills like a preview of the grave that might await him if he made the wrong choice. It was at this moment of maximum danger, when Dutch's legendary ability to talk his way out of trouble seemed insufficient to the task at hand, that salvation arrived in the form of a stranger whose intervention would change the course of history for both Dutch's gang and the broader frontier community. The man who stepped through the saloon's batwing doors moved with the confident grace of someone who had spent years learning to read dangerous situations and respond to them with deadly efficiency, his hand resting casually on his sidearm, while his eyes took in every detail of the scene with the practiced assessment of a professional gunfighter. Micah Bell was not an imposing figure in the conventional sense. He lacked the obvious physical presence that characterized men like Arthur Morgan or the quiet dignity that made Hosea Matthews so compelling, but there was something about him that immediately commanded attention and respect from everyone in the room. Perhaps it was the coldness in his pale eyes that suggested he had looked death in the face so many times that it had become an old acquaintance. Or perhaps it was simply the predatory stillness of a man who was completely comfortable with the prospect of violence and all its consequences. Whatever quality it was that Micah Bell possessed, its effect on the situation was immediate and decisive. The men who had been preparing to ambush Dutch suddenly found themselves reconsidering their options, recognizing in this newcomer the kind of dangerous competence that could turn what had seemed like easy money into a bloodbath that might leave none of them alive to spend their reward. The dynamics of power in the room shifted as subtly but completely as the wind changing direction before a storm. Micah's intervention was not accomplished through dramatic speeches or theatrical gestures, but through the much more effective method of quiet competence and implied threat. He positioned himself in a location that gave him clear lines of fire to multiple targets while limiting their ability to coordinate against him. His movements so smooth and natural that they seemed almost casual to anyone who had not spent years learning to recognize the positioning of a professional killer. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm certainty that suggested he had already calculated every possible outcome of the situation and was prepared for whichever one occurred. The standoff that had seemed destined to end in gunfire and death was resolved without a single shot being fired, though the resolution came at the cost of the business transaction that had brought Dutch to Crenshaw Hills in the first place. The merchant and his associates departed with considerably more haste than dignity, leaving behind the gold they had hoped to steal, but taking with them a healthy respect for the kind of men who could turn a carefully planned ambush into a strategic retreat through nothing more than superior positioning and unshakable nerve. In the aftermath of this narrow escape, as Dutch found himself alone in the saloon with the man who had quite possibly saved his life, the gang leader had the opportunity to study his unexpected benefactor more carefully. What he saw was a man who appeared to be roughly his own age, though the hard lines around his eyes suggested experiences that might have aged him beyond his actual years. Micah Bell dressed like a successful gambler or confidence man, his clothing neat and well-maintained but chosen for practicality rather than display, while his weapons showed the kind of care and attention that marked them as tools of a professional rather than mere accessories. More intriguingly, Micah Bell seemed to know exactly who Dutch van der Linde was, though he showed no interest in claiming any reward or attempting to curry favor through excessive deference. Instead, he treated Dutch as an equal, a fellow professional who deserved respect based on his reputation and accomplishments rather than fear based on the bounties on his head. This casual assumption of equality was both refreshing and flattering to a man who had grown accustomed to being seen as either a romantic figure or a dangerous criminal, but rarely as simply another human being worthy of ordinary consideration. The conversation that followed would prove to be one of the most consequential in the history of the van der Linde gang, though, at the time, it seemed like nothing more than the natural exchange of information between two men who had shared a dangerous experience and survived it together. Micah Bell proved to be well informed about the criminal activities occurring throughout the region, possessing the kind of detailed knowledge about law enforcement movements and potential opportunities that could only have come from years of careful observation and professional networking. Even more impressive was Micah's philosophical sophistication, his ability to discuss not only the practical aspects of outlaw life, but also the broader social and political questions that had always been central to Dutch's worldview. Where most criminals Dutch encountered were motivated by simple greed or desperation, Micah Bell seemed to understand and appreciate the ideological framework that elevated the gang's activities above mere banditry and transformed them into a form of social rebellion. Yet there was something about Micah Bell that Dutch found difficult to read, a quality of reserve or calculation that suggested depths that were not immediately apparent. Unlike most people Dutch met, who were either immediately charmed by his charismatic personality or obviously hostile to his presence, Micah seemed to maintain a kind of emotional distance that was neither warm nor cold but simply professionally neutral, as if he were constantly evaluating everyone and everything around him according to criteria that remained his own secret. This quality might have been a warning to a more suspicious man, but Dutch van der Linde had always prided himself on his ability to see the potential in people that others might overlook. He had built his gang by recognizing the hidden virtues in society's outcasts and misfits, transforming them into a family bound together by loyalty and shared purpose. If Micah Bell seemed more guarded than most, perhaps that was simply the natural caution of a man who had survived by his wits in a world that showed little mercy to those who let their guard down at the wrong moment. When Micah Bell expressed interest in joining the Vanderlinde gang, Dutch's response was influenced not only by gratitude for the man's recent assistance, but also by his assessment of what such a skilled and knowledgeable individual could contribute to their organization. The gang had always been selective in its recruitment, preferring quality over quantity and ensuring that new members possessed both the practical skills and the moral character necessary to maintain their unique culture and effectiveness. Micah Bell certainly possessed the practical skills, as his handling of the situation in the saloon had demonstrated beyond any doubt. His knowledge of criminal opportunities throughout the region would be invaluable for planning future operations, while his obvious competence with firearms would strengthen the gang's ability to handle whatever dangers they might encounter. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, his philosophical sophistication suggested that he would understand and support the ideological framework that distinguished Dutch's gang from common criminals. The decision to welcome Micah Bell into the gang was made during that first evening in Crenshaw Hills, though the formal invitation would not be extended until Dutch had had the opportunity to discuss the matter with Hosea Matthews and Arthur Morgan. The gang's democratic traditions required that major decisions be made collectively, and the addition of a new member was certainly a major decision that would affect everyone's safety and welfare. Yet Dutch's enthusiasm for their potential new recruit was evident from the moment he returned to the gang's temporary camp in the foothills of the Grizzlies, where they had been waiting out the winter while he conducted his business in Crenshaw Hills. His description of Micah Bell's intervention painted the man as both a skilled gunfighter and a kindred spirit who understood the gang's mission and values, someone who could contribute significantly to their capabilities while fitting seamlessly into their existing social structure. The reception of this news among the gang's senior members was notably mixed, reflecting the different perspectives and priorities that each brought to the evaluation of potential recruits. Arthur Morgan, whose responsibilities as the gang's primary enforcer made him naturally cautious about additions that might upset the delicate balance of personalities and loyalties that kept their dangerous lifestyle sustainable, expressed reservations about bringing in someone they knew so little about, particularly given the circumstances of his introduction to Dutch. Arthur's concerns were practical rather than personal, rooted in his extensive experience with the kinds of problems that could arise when new members failed to adapt properly to the gang's culture and expectations. He had seen too many promising recruits who possessed impressive skills but lacked the character necessary to maintain the bonds of trust and mutual dependence that were essential to their survival. The fact that Micah Bell was obviously competent and knowledgeable actually made Arthur more rather than less cautious, since such individuals often had their own agendas that might conflict with the gang's collective interests. Hosea Matthews shared many of Arthur's reservations, though his concerns were expressed with the diplomatic tact that years of partnership with Dutch had taught him was necessary when disagreeing with decisions that the gang leader had already made in his own mind. Hosea's objections centered less on Micah's practical qualifications than on what he perceived as a certain coldness or calculation in Dutch's description of the man, qualities that seemed potentially incompatible with the warm family atmosphere that had always been one of the gang's greatest strengths. More troubling to Hosea was the timing of Micah Bell's appearance, arriving at precisely the moment when Dutch most needed assistance, and providing exactly the kind of help that would create a sense of obligation and gratitude. While such timing might simply be coincidental, Hosea's long experience with confidence men and manipulators had taught him to be suspicious of coincidences that seemed too convenient to be entirely natural. Yet for all their reservations, neither Arthur nor Hosea was prepared to challenge Dutch's decision directly, particularly given the obvious gratitude their leader felt toward the man who had quite possibly saved his life. The gang's survival had always depended on Dutch's judgment and leadership, and both men had learned to trust his ability to assess people and situations, even when their own instincts suggested caution might be warranted. The integration of Micah Bell into the gang's daily life proceeded with the kind of careful, gradual process that had been developed over years of experience with new recruits, designed to test both practical abilities and personal character, while providing multiple opportunities for existing members to form their own judgments about the newcomer's suitability for permanent membership. Initially, Micah was assigned to relatively simple tasks that would allow him to demonstrate his reliability and competence without having access to sensitive information or critical responsibilities. This probationary period revealed that Micah Bell possessed many of the qualities that Dutch had identified during their first meeting, along with some additional characteristics that had not been immediately apparent. His skills with firearms were indeed exceptional, demonstrating a level of accuracy and speed that impressed even Arthur Morgan, whose own reputation as a gunfighter was well established throughout the frontier. More importantly, Micah showed no reluctance to use those skills when circumstances required, displaying the kind of cool efficiency under pressure that was essential for anyone who hoped to survive long in their dangerous profession. Micah's knowledge of criminal opportunities proved to be as extensive as Dutch had hoped, encompassing not only detailed information about potential targets throughout the region, but also sophisticated understanding of law enforcement capabilities and limitations that could help the gang avoid dangerous entanglements. His suggestions for improving their operational security and tactical approaches demonstrated strategic thinking that complemented the gang's existing expertise while introducing new perspectives and possibilities. Perhaps most significantly, Micah Bell seemed to understand and appreciate the philosophical framework that elevated the gang's activities above mere criminal behavior, expressing genuine enthusiasm for Dutch's vision of creating an alternative society based on principles of freedom and mutual aid, rather than the competitive individualism that dominated mainstream American culture. His contributions to the evening discussions that served as both entertainment and education for the gang showed intellectual sophistication that matched his practical skills. Yet even as Micah Bell demonstrated his value as a recruit and began to earn acceptance from most of the gang's members, there remained subtle undercurrents of tension that reflected the reservations that Arthur Morgan and Hosea Matthews had expressed from the beginning. Some gang members found Micah's manner slightly off-putting, describing him as too calculating or self-interested, while others were disturbed by what they perceived as a certain callousness in his attitude toward violence and its consequences. These concerns were difficult to articulate precisely because they involved subtle qualities of personality and character rather than obvious failings or incompetencies that could be addressed directly. Micah Bell performed his assigned duties competently, followed the gang's rules and traditions, and contributed meaningfully to their collective welfare. Yet, something about his presence seemed to alter the emotional atmosphere of their community in ways that were hard to define, but impossible to ignore. The most visible manifestation of these changes was in Dutch himself, who seemed increasingly drawn to Micah's perspectives and suggestions, often seeking his advice on matters that had previously been handled through consultation with Hosea and Arthur. This shift in influence was subtle at first, manifesting primarily in small changes in planning and strategy, but it represented a fundamental alteration in the gang's decision-making process that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Dutch's growing reliance on Micah Bell's counsel reflected not only his gratitude for the man's life-saving intervention in Crenshaw Hills, but also his appreciation for having found someone who seemed to understand and share his intellectual interests and philosophical commitments. Where conversations with Arthur tended to focus on practical matters and discussions with Hosea often involved gentle challenges to his more ambitious schemes. Talks with Micah were characterized by mutual reinforcement and encouragement of increasingly bold and risky enterprises. This dynamic was particularly evident in the planning sessions that preceded major operations, where Micah's contributions often involved suggesting modifications that would increase potential profits while minimizing the kinds of safeguards and precautions that Hosea and Arthur typically insisted upon. His arguments were sophisticated and persuasive, framed in terms of the gang's ideological commitments and their need to strike meaningful blows against the corrupt system they opposed, making it difficult to object to them without seeming to oppose the very principles that held their community together. The winter months that the gang spent in the Northern Grizzlies provided ample opportunity for Micah Bell to solidify his position within their social structure and to demonstrate his value as both a practical contributor and an intellectual companion to Dutch van der Linde. The harsh conditions and enforced isolation of their mountain hideout created an atmosphere of intimacy and mutual dependence that typically either forged strong bonds between individuals or revealed incompatibilities that made long-term association impossible. In Micah's case, the winter proved to be a period of successful integration as he adapted smoothly to the gang's routines and traditions, while contributing his own expertise and perspectives to their collective knowledge and capabilities. His suggestions for improving their camp security and his success in supplementing their food supplies through hunting and trapping earned practical respect, while his participation in evening discussions and his obvious appreciation for Dutch's leadership philosophy earned intellectual acceptance. By the time the spring of 1899 arrived, and the gang began to consider their options for the coming year, Micah Bell had established himself as a valued member of their community, whose opinions carried significant weight in their collective decision-making processes. His influence with Dutch had grown to the point where his suggestions often became the starting points for planning sessions, while his practical knowledge of regional conditions and opportunities made him an invaluable resource for identifying potential targets and assessing their feasibility. The migration southward that brought the gang to the vicinity of Blackwater was itself influenced by information and suggestions that Micah had provided, as he had described the growing town as offering exactly the kinds of opportunities that might provide them with the resources necessary to establish the independent community that remained Dutch's ultimate goal. His knowledge of the area's geography and his understanding of local law enforcement capabilities convinced Dutch that Blackwater represented their best chance for conducting the kind of major operation that could set them up for permanent retirement from criminal activity. This growing influence over Dutch's strategic thinking represented a significant shift in the gang's internal dynamics, as Micah Bell gradually displaced Hosea Matthews as Dutch's primary advisor and intellectual companion. The change was not sudden or dramatic, but it was nonetheless profound in its implications for how the gang would approach future challenges and opportunities, particularly given the very different personalities and priorities that the two men brought to their advisory roles. Where Hosea's counsel had always been characterized by caution and careful consideration of potential consequences, emphasizing the importance of maintaining the gang's safety and solidarity above all other considerations, Micah's advice tended toward boldness and ambition, focused on maximizing immediate gains while accepting higher levels of risk as necessary costs of achieving meaningful success. These different approaches reflected not only personality differences, but also fundamentally different assessments of the gang's position and prospects in a rapidly changing world. The tragic irony of Micah Bell's integration into the van der Linde gang was that his arrival came at precisely the moment when his particular skills and perspectives were least likely to serve their collective interests. though none of them possessed the foresight to recognize this at the time. The golden years of outlaw life were drawing to a close, and what the gang most needed was the kind of wisdom and restraint that might help them navigate the transition to a more settled existence, not the encouragement toward increasingly ambitious criminal enterprises that Micah provided. Yet such recognition would only come with hindsight, after the consequences of Micah's influence had played out in tragedy and loss that would shatter the bonds that had held the gang together through so many previous challenges and hardships. In the spring of 1899, as they established their camp outside Blackwater and began planning what would become known as the massacre, the gang members saw only opportunity ahead and trusted in the leadership and judgment that had carried them through so many previous trials and triumphs. In the spring of 1899, when the harsh winter of the Northern Grizzlies finally released its grip on the land and allowed the Van der Linde gang to emerge from their mountain refuge like bears awakening from hibernation, they found themselves drawn southward toward a settlement that embodied both the promise and the peril of the rapidly changing American frontier. Blackwater, West Elizabeth, was a town caught in the throes of transformation, evolving with breathtaking speed from the modest trading post it had been just a few short years earlier into something that aspired to the status of a genuine city, complete with all the opportunities and dangers that such ambition inevitably brought in its wake. The Blackwater that greeted the gang in the early months of 1899 bore little resemblance to the sleepy riverside community that Dutch Van der Linde remembered from his earlier visits to the region, though those memories carried a weight of personal significance that went far beyond mere criminal reconnaissance. This was the place where his beloved mother had been laid to rest years before, her grave serving as the only permanent connection he maintained to the settled world he had otherwise rejected, a tender reminder of the woman who had given him life, even as she had failed to understand the path that life would ultimately take him down. Dutch's mother had been buried in Blackwater's modest cemetery during a time when the town consisted of little more than a handful of wooden buildings clustered around a ferry landing, serving the needs of travelers and traders who found themselves in need of passage across the waters that divided the territories. She had been a woman of simple faith and conventional values, the kind of person who believed that hard work and moral rectitude would inevitably be rewarded by a benevolent providence, and her son's descent into outlawry would have broken her heart had she lived to witness it. Yet even as Dutch rejected the conventional morality that his mother had tried to instill in him, he maintained a deep and abiding love for her memory that manifested itself in periodic pilgrimages to her graveside, moments of quiet reflection, where the silver-tongued philosopher of criminal rebellion became simply a son mourning the loss of the one person who had loved him unconditionally despite all his faults and failures. These visits were among the few times when Dutch allowed himself to acknowledge the loneliness that lay at the heart of his chosen lifestyle, the price he paid for his rejection of society's expectations and demands. The emotional significance of Blackwater as the final resting place of Dutch's mother created a complex web of associations that influenced his assessment of the town's potential as both refuge and opportunity for his gang. On one level, the familiar territory represented a kind of homecoming, a return to a place where he had roots and connections that predated his criminal career and might provide advantages in terms of local knowledge and community acceptance. On another level, the rapid changes that had transformed the town since his last visit served as a stark reminder of how quickly the world was evolving beyond the reach of men like himself. The Blackwater of 1899 was a community intoxicated by its own growth and possibilities, flush with the kind of optimism that characterized frontier settlements during their periods of most dramatic expansion. New buildings seemed to sprout from the ground like mushrooms after rain, their fresh-cut lumber and gleaming paint testament to the confidence that investors and residents felt about the town's future prospects. The muddy streets that Dutch remembered from his previous visits had been replaced by wooden walkways and even some stretches of actual paved road, while gas lamps provided illumination that extended the active hours of commerce and social activity well into the evening hours. The transformation was not merely physical but cultural and economic as well, as Blackwater attracted an increasingly sophisticated population of merchants, professionals, and entrepreneurs, who brought with them the attitudes and expectations of more established communities. The rough and ready atmosphere that had characterized the town during its trading post days was giving way to something more refined and civilized, complete with an opera house, a newspaper, and social clubs that attempted to replicate the cultural amenities available in larger cities. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability and progress lay currents of corruption and moral compromise that were invisible to casual observers, but immediately apparent to men like Dutch van der Linde, who had spent their lives learning to recognize the gap between public virtue and private vice. The rapid influx of money and people had created opportunities for graft and manipulation that attracted a less savory element of entrepreneurs. Men who understood that fortunes could be made more quickly through political influence and backroom dealing than through honest commerce and industry. This corruption was particularly evident in the town's political structure, where positions of authority were bought and sold with the same casual efficiency that characterized transactions in the livestock market. Mayor and council seats went to the highest bidders, while law enforcement positions were distributed based on political loyalty rather than competence or integrity. The result was a government that existed primarily to serve the interests of those wealthy enough to purchase influence, while the needs and concerns of ordinary citizens were addressed only when they aligned with the profit motives of the town's real power brokers. The economic boom that drove Blackwater's expansion was fueled by several different sources of wealth, each of which created its own opportunities for both legitimate business and criminal enterprise. The town's strategic location on the water made it a natural hub for shipping and transportation, with goods and passengers flowing through the community in volumes that would have been unimaginable during its trading post days. This constant movement of valuable cargo created numerous possibilities for theft and robbery, though it also brought increased attention from law enforcement agencies charged with protecting interstate commerce. More significantly for Dutch's purposes, Blackwater had become a regional banking center, with several financial institutions establishing branch offices to serve the needs of the surrounding agricultural and mining communities. These banks handled not only the routine deposits and loans of local residents, but also the more substantial sums involved in land speculation, mining ventures, and railroad construction, creating concentrations of wealth that were tempting targets for men willing to take the risks involved in challenging such heavily protected institutions. The presence of so much money in such a relatively small and underprotected community was precisely the kind of opportunity that had always attracted Dutch's attention, though his approach to evaluating potential targets had evolved considerably since his early days as a simple bank robber. The philosophical framework that he had developed over the years required him to consider not only the practical aspects of any criminal enterprise, but also its moral implications and its alignment with the gang's broader mission of striking back against the corrupt system that oppressed honest working people. From this perspective, the banks of Blackwater represented particularly attractive targets because they served primarily to facilitate the kind of speculation and exploitation that Dutch saw as characteristic of the worst aspects of American capitalism. The money flowing through these institutions was not the hard-earned savings of working families, but the profits generated by land grabs, resource extraction, and financial manipulation, making its redistribution through robbery a form of rough justice rather than simple theft. The gang's initial reconnaissance of Blackwater was conducted with the systematic thoroughness that had become their standard practice over years of successful operations, though the process was complicated by the town's rapid growth and constantly changing circumstances. What had been a reliable piece of intelligence one week might be completely outdated the next. As new businesses opened, old ones closed, and the patterns of daily life shifted to accommodate the community's expanding population and evolving economic base. Arthur Morgan and John Marston took primary responsibility for gathering information about the town's layout, law enforcement capabilities, and daily routines, spending days wandering the streets in various disguises while carefully noting the locations of banks, the schedules of security patrols, and the habits of potentially valuable targets. Their observations revealed a community that was more prosperous and better organized than most frontier settlements, but still sufficiently chaotic and understaffed to offer opportunities for well-planned criminal activities. Meanwhile, Hosea Matthews focused his attention on the human aspects of the intelligence-gathering process, using his remarkable skills as a confidence man to strike up conversations with local residents and extract information about the town's power structure, its sources of wealth, and its vulnerabilities to manipulation and exploitation. His natural ability to present himself as a harmless and trustworthy individual made him invaluable for this kind of work, as people found themselves sharing confidential information with a man they had known for only a few minutes but somehow felt they could trust completely. The picture that emerged from these combined efforts was of a community that offered both significant opportunities and equally significant risks for men in their profession. The concentration of wealth was indeed substantial, with several banks handling sums that could set the gang up for years if successfully appropriated. But the town's growing importance had also attracted increased attention from federal law enforcement agencies who took a dim view of interference with interstate commerce and banking operations. More troubling from a strategic standpoint was the evidence that Blackwater was not the isolated and self-contained community it appeared to be on the surface, but rather a node in a larger network of political and economic relationships that extended throughout the region and beyond. An attack on the town's financial institutions would not simply be a local crime, but a challenge to interests that commanded resources and influence far exceeding anything the gang had previously encountered in their criminal career. Yet for all these concerns and complications, the potential rewards offered by Blackwater's banking industry were so substantial that they could hardly be ignored, particularly given the gang's increasingly urgent need for the kind of major score that would allow them to retire from active criminal work and establish the independent community that remained Dutch's ultimate goal. The philosophical appeal of striking a blow against the corrupt financial system that was transforming the American frontier into a playground for wealthy speculators provided additional justification for accepting the elevated risks involved in such an ambitious undertaking. Dutch's own emotional connection to Blackwater through his mother's burial site added another layer of meaning to the potential operation, transforming what might otherwise have been simply a business decision into something approaching a personal crusade. The town that had provided his mother's final resting place had been corrupted by the same forces of greed and exploitation that the gang had dedicated their lives to opposing, making its banks legitimate targets for the kind of redistributive justice that Dutch saw as both morally necessary and practically beneficial. The gang's camp outside Blackwater was established with careful attention to the balance between accessibility and security that had become their standard practice over years of nomadic living, positioned close enough to town to facilitate reconnaissance and planning activities while remaining sufficiently hidden to avoid detection by local law enforcement or curious citizens. The location they selected offered multiple escape routes, adequate water and grazing for their horses, and natural defensive positions that could be used to advantage if they found themselves under attack. Life in the Blackwater camp fell into the familiar rhythms that had sustained the gang through countless previous operations, though there were subtle differences that reflected both the growing sophistication of their criminal activities and the changing dynamics within their leadership structure. The evening planning sessions that had always been central to their decision-making process now featured more prominent participation from Micah Bell, whose knowledge of the region and confidence in his own judgment increasingly influenced the direction of their discussions. Dutch himself seemed energized by the possibilities that Blackwater represented, his natural charisma and enthusiasm reaching levels that reminded older gang members of the early days when their leader's vision of creating an alternative society had seemed not only possible but inevitable. His speeches around the campfire took on an almost evangelical fervor as he described the transformation that would follow their successful appropriation of the town's banking wealth, the freedom and security that such resources would provide for every member of their extended family. Yet beneath this surface excitement, more observant members of the gang detected undercurrents of tension and uncertainty that suggested not everyone shared Dutch's confidence about their current course of action. Hosea Matthews, in particular, seemed troubled by aspects of their planning that he was reluctant to articulate directly, though his concerns were evident to anyone who knew how to read the subtle signs of his displeasure and worry. The specific nature of Hosea's reservations would only become clear as their plans developed, and the full scope of the risks they were accepting became apparent to those with sufficient experience to recognize the warning signs that others might miss or dismiss as overcaution. For the present, however, such concerns remained in the background, overshadowed by the optimism and anticipation that characterized the gang's preparation for what they believed would be their most significant and successful operation to date. As spring turned towards summer and their reconnaissance of Blackwater continued to reveal new opportunities and refine their understanding of the challenges they would face, Dutch van der Linde and his followers found themselves poised on the brink of decisions that would determine not only the success or failure of their criminal enterprise, but the ultimate fate of the family they had built together through years of shared hardship and mutual devotion. As the weeks passed and summer heat began to settle over the plains of West Elizabeth like a heavy blanket that pressed down upon the earth with increasing weight, the van der Linde gang found themselves drawn deeper into the planning of what would become the most ambitious and ultimately the most catastrophic operation of their criminal career. The intelligence they had gathered during their reconnaissance of Blackwater had revealed an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true, a convergence of circumstances that promised rewards substantial enough to transform their entire future if they possessed the courage and skill necessary to seize the moment when it presented itself. The centerpiece of their emerging plan was a ferry that arrived in Blackwater on a regular schedule, carrying passengers and cargo between the growing town and the larger commercial centers that lay beyond the immediate region. Yet this particular vessel was of interest to Dutch van der Linde and his followers, not for its routine transportation services, but for the special cargo it carried on certain voyages. When the banking institutions of Blackwater required the movement of substantial sums of currency to meet the demands of their expanding operations and increasingly sophisticated financial transactions, the information about these money shipments had come to their attention through the patient work of Hosea Matthews, whose skills as a confidence man had allowed him to extract crucial details from bank employees and shipping clerks who had no idea that their casual conversations were being systematically mined for intelligence by one of the most accomplished criminals on the American frontier. The picture that emerged from these sources was of a transportation system that moved enormous amounts of cash with security measures that were adequate for ordinary circumstances, but potentially vulnerable to a well-planned and palmed, expertly executed assault. According to the intelligence that Hosea had gathered through his careful cultivation of local sources, the ferry's next major money shipment would carry approximately $150,000 in currency destined for the banks of Blackwater, a sum so substantial that it represented more wealth than the gang had accumulated through years of train robberies and smaller criminal enterprises. This was the kind of score that legends were made of, the sort of achievement that would be talked about in saloons and around campfires for decades to come, assuming that those responsible survived long enough to enjoy their newfound wealth and reputation. Yet even as Dutch van der Linde's imagination was captured by the possibilities that such a massive theft would create for his gang's future, more experienced members of their organization recognized that the potential rewards came with equally substantial risks that demanded the most careful consideration and planning. Hosea Matthews, whose long partnership with Dutch had taught him to recognize when his friend's enthusiasm was beginning to override his judgment, expressed reservations about the wisdom of attempting such an ambitious operation given the attention it would inevitably attract from federal law enforcement agencies. The concerns that Hosea raised were both practical and philosophical, reflecting not only his assessment of the tactical challenges they would face, but also his growing unease about the direction that Dutch's leadership had taken since Micah Bell's arrival in their ranks. Where previous operations had been characterized by careful planning, minimal violence, and attention to the broader implications of their actions, the ferry robbery seemed to embody a different approach that prioritized immediate gains over long-term security and accepted levels of risk that veteran criminals would normally consider unacceptable. Arthur Morgan shared many of Hosea's reservations, though his concerns were expressed more in terms of practical logistics than philosophical objections to their chosen course of action. Arthur's experience as the gang's primary enforcer had taught him to recognize the difference between calculated risks and reckless gambles, and several aspects of the ferry robbery plan struck him as falling dangerously close to the latter category, particularly given the limited time they would have to complete the operation before law enforcement agencies could respond in overwhelming force. The tactical challenges were indeed formidable, beginning with the simple fact that any robbery conducted in the heart of Blackwater would immediately attract the attention of local law enforcement and potentially federal agencies as well, given the interstate nature of the commerce being disrupted. Unlike their previous operations, which had typically been conducted in isolated locations where they could control the environment and limit the number of potential witnesses, the ferry robbery would take place in full view of a substantial civilian population whose reactions could not be predicted or controlled. More troubling still was the intelligence suggesting that Blackwater's rapid growth had attracted increased attention from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, whose resources and capabilities far exceeded anything the gang had previously encountered in their criminal career. The Pinkertons represented a new form of law enforcement that operated according to different rules than local sheriffs and territorial marshals, with the backing of powerful corporate interests and the federal government itself, making them opponents who could not be intimidated, bribed, or outgunned through conventional means. Yet, for all these legitimate concerns, and the wisdom of the voices raised in opposition to the operation, Dutch van der Linde found himself increasingly committed to proceeding with the ferry robbery, driven by a combination of factors that included not only the obvious appeal of the potential financial rewards, but also deeper psychological and emotional needs that he was perhaps not entirely conscious of himself. The opportunity to strike such a significant blow against the banking system that he saw as the embodiment of everything corrupt and oppressive about American society held an almost irresistible appeal for a man whose entire adult life had been dedicated to opposing such institutions. Even more compelling was the influence of Micah Bell, whose enthusiasm for the ferry robbery plan had grown to match and perhaps exceed Dutch's own excitement about the possibilities it represented. Micah's arguments in favor of proceeding with the operation were sophisticated and persuasive, framed in terms of the gang's ideological commitments and their obligation to strike meaningful blows against the corrupt system they opposed, making it difficult for other gang members to voice objections without seeming to question the fundamental principles that held their community together. Micah's advocacy for the ferry robbery was particularly effective because it aligned so closely with Dutch's own philosophical inclinations and long-standing resentments against the forces that were transforming the American frontier into something unrecognizable from the free and open society he had once known. When Micah spoke of the operation as an opportunity to demonstrate that the gang remained capable of significant achievements despite the changing circumstances that surrounded them, he was appealing to pride, an ambition that ran deeper than mere criminal greed. The planning sessions that followed Dutch's decision to proceed with the ferry robbery revealed the extent to which Micah Bell's influence had reshaped the gang's decision-making processes and internal dynamics. Where previous operations had been characterized by extensive consultation and democratic discussion that gave every experienced gang member an opportunity to contribute their expertise and express their concerns, the ferry robbery plan developed along lines that reflected primarily Dutch's vision and Micah's tactical suggestions, with limited input from the voices that might have counseled greater caution. This shift in planning methodology was particularly evident in the division of responsibilities for the operation itself, which departed significantly from the gang's traditional practices in ways that isolated their most experienced members from the most dangerous aspects of the robbery. Arthur Morgan and Hosea Matthews, whose skills and judgment had been central to the success of virtually every major operation the gang had undertaken, found themselves assigned to a separate task that would keep them away from the ferry during the crucial moments when their expertise would be most valuable. The ostensible justification for this division of labor was the simultaneous execution of a real estate scam that Hosea had been developing as an alternative source of income, a confidence game that promised substantial returns with minimal risk if properly executed. The logic of conducting both operations simultaneously was that success in either venture would provide the gang with the resources they needed to establish their independent community, while success in both would create a financial foundation that could support their plans for decades to come. Yet the practical effect of this arrangement was to separate Dutch from the steady counsel of his oldest and most trusted advisors at precisely the moment when their wisdom and experience would be most crucial to the success and safety of the entire enterprise. The decision to proceed with the ferry robbery while Arthur and Hosea were occupied elsewhere represented a fundamental departure from the collaborative leadership model that had sustained the gang through years of successful operations, replacing it with a more autocratic approach that concentrated decision-making authority in Dutch's hands, while reducing the influence of voices that might urge greater caution. The specific details of the ferry robbery plan that emerged from these truncated planning sessions revealed both the ambition and the fundamental recklessness that characterized the gang's approach to this most crucial of operations. The robbery itself was scheduled to take place during daylight hours when the ferry would be docked at Blackwater's main wharf, a location that offered both advantages and disadvantages from a tactical standpoint, but that ultimately favored rapid execution over careful preparation and contingency planning. The advantages of conducting the robbery during the ferry's regular docking procedure included the predictability of timing and location, which would allow the gang members involved to position themselves optimally before the operation began and to coordinate their actions according to a predetermined schedule that minimized uncertainty and confusion. The presence of civilian passengers and crew aboard the ferry would also provide potential human shields and bargaining chips if negotiations with law enforcement became necessary during the escape phase of the operation. Yet these tactical advantages came at the cost of exposure and vulnerability that more experienced criminals would have recognized as potentially fatal flaws in their planning. The decision to conduct the robbery in broad daylight at one of Blackwater's busiest commercial locations guaranteed maximum visibility for their actions, while providing numerous opportunities for witnesses to observe and report details that could facilitate their identification and capture by pursuing law enforcement agencies. Even more dangerously, the ferry robbery plan relied heavily on the assumption that local law enforcement would be caught off guard by the suddenness and audacity of the attack, allowing the gang members involved to complete their theft and begin their escape before organized resistance could be mounted. This assumption reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how seriously federal agencies took crimes against interstate commerce and banking operations, as well as an underestimation of the resources and capabilities that such agencies could deploy in response to major criminal incidents. The gang's intelligence gathering had focused primarily on identifying opportunities and assessing potential rewards, while paying insufficient attention to the defensive measures and response capabilities that would be brought to bear against anyone who attempted to disrupt the financial operations they were targeting. This selective attention to information that supported their preferred course of action, while minimizing or ignoring intelligence that suggested greater caution, was characteristic of decision-making processes that had been compromised by wishful thinking and emotional commitment to predetermined conclusions. As the date selected for the ferry robbery approached and final preparations began in earnest, the atmosphere within the gang's camp outside Blackwater became increasingly tense and divided, reflecting the unresolved disagreements about the wisdom of their chosen course of action and the growing recognition that they were about to embark upon an operation whose consequences would extend far beyond the immediate success or failure of the robbery itself. The bonds of loyalty and mutual trust that had sustained them through previous challenges were being tested by fundamental disagreements about risk assessment and strategic priorities that could not be resolved through discussion or compromise. Dutch van der Linde himself seemed to recognize the gravity of what they were about to attempt, though his public expressions of confidence and optimism masked private doubts and anxieties that he was reluctant to acknowledge even to himself. His speeches to the assembled gang members took on an increasingly fervent quality as he sought to maintain morale and unity in the face of obvious concerns and reservations, while his private conversations with Micah Bell revealed a man who was simultaneously excited by the possibilities that success would create and terrified by the consequences that failure would bring. The final week before the robbery was marked by a series of small incidents and observations that would later be recognized as warning signs that should have prompted a reconsideration of their plans, though at the time they were dismissed as coincidences or minor complications that could be overcome through superior planning and execution. Local law enforcement seemed more active and vigilant than usual, with additional patrols visible throughout Blackwater and increased security measures evident around the town's banking district and commercial areas. More ominously, several gang members reported encounters with strangers who seemed to be observing their activities with unusual interest. though these incidents were interpreted as routine criminal paranoia rather than evidence of organized surveillance by professional law enforcement agents. The possibility that their presence in the area had been detected and that their plans had been compromised was raised during planning sessions but was ultimately dismissed as unlikely given the care they had taken to maintain their cover and the absence of any direct evidence of official interest in their activities. The decision to proceed with the ferry robbery, despite these warning signs, reflected the psychological and emotional investment that Dutch and his key supporters had made in the operation, an investment that made objective assessment of risks and alternatives increasingly difficult as the planned date approached. The operation had become more than simply a criminal enterprise, but a test of the gang's continued relevance and effectiveness in a changing world, making cancellation or postponement feel like admissions of weakness and decline that were psychologically unacceptable to men who had built their identities around their reputation for courage and competence. On the morning selected for the robbery, as Dutch van der Linde and his chosen companions made their final preparations for what they believed would be their most glorious achievement, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter their world and transform their criminal organization from a successful enterprise into a collection of desperate fugitives whose survival would depend upon their ability to adapt to circumstances that none of them had anticipated or prepared for in their confident planning sessions. The morning of the ferry robbery dawned clear and bright over Blackwater, with the kind of crystalline sunlight that seemed to promise good fortune to those bold enough to seize the opportunities that fate placed before them. Dutch van der Linde rose from his bedroll with the confident stride of a man who believed himself to be on the threshold of his greatest triumph, his mind already racing ahead to envision the transformation that would follow their successful appropriation of the $150,000 that waited aboard the ferry like a gift from Providence itself. The preparations for the operation unfolded with the practiced efficiency that characterized all of the gang's major enterprises, though there were subtle differences in atmosphere and procedure that reflected both the magnitude of what they were attempting and the altered dynamics that had emerged within their leadership structure. Since Micah Bell's arrival, Dutch's pre-operation briefing was shorter and more focused than usual, concentrating on immediate tactical concerns rather than the broader philosophical framework that typically provided context for their criminal activities. Micah Bell's presence at Dutch's side during these final preparations was both prominent and telling, his role in the planning and execution of the robbery having evolved to a level that effectively made him Dutch's co-leader for this most crucial of operations. The deference that other gang members showed to Micah's suggestions and the weight that Dutch gave to his tactical assessments represented a fundamental shift in the gang's power structure that would have profound implications for how the operation unfolded and how its consequences would be managed. The division of the gang for the day's activities proceeded according to the plan that had been developed during their extended planning sessions, with Arthur Morgan and Hosea Matthews departing early to pursue their real estate scam in a different part of town, while Dutch, Micah, John Marston, and several other gang members prepared to execute the ferry robbery itself. This separation of their most experienced members from the primary operation represented a departure from traditional practice that would prove to have tragic consequences as events spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control or predict, as Arthur and Hosea rode away from the camp toward their separate assignment. Both men carried with them unspoken reservations about the wisdom of the course of action that Dutch had committed them to, though their loyalty to their leader and their faith in his judgment prevented them from voicing their concerns more forcefully. The sight of their departing figures served as a reminder of the gang's traditional collaborative approach to major operations, an approach that was being abandoned just when it would be most needed. The gang members who remained to carry out the ferry robbery made their way into Blackwater through different routes and at staggered intervals, their movements carefully coordinated to avoid attracting attention, while ensuring that they would all be in position when the ferry arrived at its scheduled docking time. The town bustled with its usual morning activity as merchants opened their shops, workers began their daily labors, and early passengers gathered at the wharf to await transportation to destinations throughout the region. Dutch van der Linde positioned himself where he could observe the ferry's approach while maintaining communication with the other members of his team, his demeanor calm and confident despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Years of successful operations had given him an almost supernatural faith in his ability to improvise solutions to unexpected problems, though this confidence would soon be tested in ways that would reveal its limitations and ultimately contribute to the catastrophe that was about to unfold. Micah Bell took up a position that would allow him to provide covering fire if the robbery encountered resistance, his weapons checked and ready, while his pale eyes scanned the surrounding area for any signs of unusual law enforcement activity or potential complications. His apparent calm masked an inner tension that reflected his understanding of the risks they were accepting, though his commitment to proceeding with the operation remained absolute despite the warning signs that more cautious observers might have heeded. John Marston, still relatively inexperienced in major operations but eager to prove himself worthy of the trust that Dutch had placed in him, found himself assigned to a crucial role in controlling the ferry's passengers and crew during the robbery itself. The responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders, particularly given his awareness that any mistakes on his part could endanger not only himself but all of his companions, who were depending on his competence and courage under pressure. The other gang members involved in the operation took their assigned positions with the disciplined efficiency that had been drilled into them through years of training and experience, though several later admitted to feeling an unusual sense of foreboding as they watched the ferry approach Blackwater's main wharf. These premonitions were dismissed at the time as normal pre-operation anxiety, but they may have reflected an unconscious recognition of details and patterns that suggested the situation was not as straightforward as it appeared on the surface. The ferry itself was a substantial vessel that reflected Blackwater's growing importance as a commercial and transportation hub, its size and passenger capacity far exceeding what would have been necessary during the town's earlier incarnation as a simple trading post. The sight of so impressive a boat tied up at Blackwater's wharf served as a visible reminder of how rapidly the frontier was being transformed by the forces of commerce and industry that Dutch's gang had dedicated their lives to opposing. As the ferry completed its docking procedures and passengers began to disembark for their brief stop in Blackwater, Dutch gave the signal that initiated what was intended to be a swift and efficient appropriation of the money shipment that represented their ticket to financial independence and security. The first moments of the robbery proceeded according to plan, with gang members moving into position and asserting control over the vessel's crew, and remaining passengers with the kind of practiced authority that minimized resistance and confusion. Dutch himself boarded the ferry with the confident bearing of a man who had conducted dozens of similar operations, his silver tongue immediately going to work to calm frightened passengers and crew members while establishing the parameters within which the robbery would be conducted. His natural charisma and ability to project an aura of competent authority served him well in these initial moments, as people responded to his presence with the kind of cooperation that made complex criminal operations possible. The location of the money shipment was quickly identified, and the process of transferring the cash to containers that could be easily transported during their escape began with encouraging efficiency, the $150,000 proving to be every bit as substantial as their intelligence had suggested. The sight of so much currency in one place was intoxicating for men who had spent years accumulating wealth through much smaller and more dangerous enterprises, representing not just immediate financial gain, but validation of their decision to attempt such an ambitious operation. Yet even as the robbery proceeded according to their carefully developed plan, subtle signs of trouble were beginning to manifest in ways that would soon escalate beyond anyone's ability to manage or control. The civilian population of Blackwater was reacting to the unusual activity at the wharf with more curiosity and concern than had been anticipated, while local law enforcement seemed to be responding to reports of suspicious behavior with unusual speed and coordination. More ominously, the gang members conducting the robbery began to notice individuals in the crowd whose behavior and positioning suggested professional training and organization rather than simple civilian curiosity. These observers maintained distances and sight lines that were tactically significant while displaying the kind of calm alertness that characterized experienced law enforcement officers or military personnel rather than ordinary townspeople drawn by the spectacle of a robbery in progress. The first direct indication that their operation was not proceeding according to plan came in the form of systematic positioning of armed men around the wharf area. Individuals whose coordinated movements and professional demeanor made it clear that this was not a spontaneous response by local law enforcement, but a carefully planned counter-operation that had been prepared in advance. The implications of this discovery were staggering, suggesting that their presence and intentions had been detected and that they were walking into a trap that had been specifically designed to capture or eliminate them. Dutch's immediate recognition of the changed circumstances demonstrated both his experience as a criminal leader and his ability to adapt quickly to unexpected developments, though the options available to him were severely limited by the public nature of their location and the presence of numerous innocent civilians who could be harmed if the situation escalated to violence. His decision to proceed with completing the robbery rather than attempting an immediate escape reflected both his commitment to the operation and his assessment that they had advanced too far to withdraw without accepting the very risks they had hoped to avoid. The transformation of the ferry robbery from a carefully planned criminal operation into a chaotic running battle began with the appearance of Pinkerton agents and federal marshals who had been positioned to respond to exactly this type of incident, their superior numbers and firepower, making it immediately clear that the gang was facing opposition, unlike anything they had encountered in their previous criminal activities. These were not local sheriffs who might be intimidated or outgunned, but professional law enforcement officers with extensive training and resources specifically dedicated to dealing with organized criminal enterprises. The first shots of what would become known as the Blackwater Massacre were fired in circumstances that remain disputed to this day, though eyewitness accounts suggest that the violence began when Dutch van der Linde found himself cornered by federal agents and made the fatal decision to use a young woman named Heidi McCourt as a human shield in his attempt to fight his way clear of the trap that had been laid for him. The woman was an innocent bystander who had been on the ferry as a passenger, a young mother whose only crime was being in the wrong place when desperate men made decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The killing of Heidi McCourt represented a fundamental departure from the moral code that had previously governed the gang's criminal activities, a crossing of lines that Dutch himself would have condemned in others, and that created fissures within the gang's sense of identity and purpose that would never fully heal. The act was committed in a moment of desperation and panic rather than deliberate malice, but its consequences extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation to undermine the philosophical framework that had justified their lifestyle and bound them together as a community. John Marston's wounding occurred in the fierce gunfight that erupted immediately after Dutch's killing of the innocent woman, as federal agents and gang members exchanged fire across the ferry's deck, while terrified civilians sought shelter wherever they could find it. The bullet that struck John's arm was not life-threatening, but it served as a stark reminder of how quickly their carefully planned operation had deteriorated into the kind of chaotic violence that they had always sought to avoid. In their criminal activities, the gunfight that followed was unlike anything that Blackwater had ever witnessed, transforming the peaceful commercial district into a battlefield where the sound of gunfire echoed off building walls while smoke from black powder weapons created a fog of war that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The gang members involved fought with the desperate courage of men who understood that capture would mean death or life imprisonment, while their opponents demonstrated the relentless professionalism of law enforcement officers who saw the criminals as a threat to the social order that they had sworn to protect. Micah Bell's performance during the running battle that spread through Blackwater's streets revealed both his skills as a gunfighter and his willingness to escalate violence beyond what circumstances required. His aggressive tactics contributing to the casualty count while doing little to improve the gang's chances of successful escape. His encouragement of Dutch's most violent impulses during the crisis demonstrated an aspect of his character that had been hidden during his integration into the gang, but that would have far-reaching implications for their future, operations and internal dynamics. The death of Jenny Kirk occurred during the gang's fighting retreat through Blackwater streets as they attempted to reach their horses and escape the overwhelming numbers of law enforcement officers who were converging on their position from multiple directions. Jenny was struck by a bullet fired by one of the pursuing officers, the wound proving fatal despite the efforts of her companions to provide medical assistance while under fire from multiple directions. Jenny's death was particularly tragic because she had been one of the gang's most recent recruits, a young woman who had been rescued from desperate circumstances and welcomed into their family with the kind of generosity and protection that represented the best aspects of their community values. Her loss was felt deeply by all the gang members who survived the massacre, serving as a reminder of the human cost of the choices they had made and the consequences that extended beyond their own personal fates. Matt Callender's fate during the Blackwater massacre remains somewhat unclear, though the evidence suggests that he was severely wounded during the initial gunfight at the ferry and subsequently captured by federal agents, who were more interested in extracting information about the gang's operations and future plans than in providing medical treatment for his injuries. His capture represented a serious security breach that would have implications for the gang's safety long after they had escaped from Blackwater itself. The wounding of Davy Callender was perhaps the most serious injury sustained by any gang member who managed to escape from Blackwater. The bullet that struck him in the abdomen, causing the kind of internal damage that was often fatal in an era before modern surgical techniques and antibiotics. Davy's condition would continue to deteriorate during their escape, creating additional challenges for a group that was already struggling to evade pursuit while caring for multiple wounded members. Sean Maguire's capture occurred when he was knocked unconscious during the street fighting that followed their escape from the ferry, his prone form being discovered by law enforcement officers who recognized the opportunity to take a living gang member prisoner for interrogation and eventual prosecution. Sean's fate would remain uncertain for weeks, creating anxiety and guilt among the surviving gang members who were unsure whether he was alive or dead, and whether they had any obligation to attempt a rescue that might endanger the rest of their community. The gang's escape from Blackwater was accomplished through a combination of desperate fighting, tactical misdirection, and sheer good fortune that allowed them to reach their horses and begin their flight toward the mountains before the full weight of federal law enforcement could be brought to bear against them. The running battle through the town's streets had created chaos and confusion that worked to their advantage, preventing their pursuers from coordinating an effective response until the gang had already disappeared into the wilderness that surrounded Blackwater. Yet their escape came at a cost that extended far beyond the immediate casualties and injuries they had sustained during the fighting. The money they had successfully stolen from the ferry, that $150,000 that had justified all the risks they had accepted, had to be abandoned during their flight, as the weight and bulk of the currency made rapid movement impossible, while, under pursuit by mounted law enforcement officers, Dutch's decision to cache the money somewhere in or near Blackwater, rather than attempting to carry it during their escape, was tactically sound given their circumstances, but it meant that their most ambitious criminal operation had yielded no immediate benefits while creating enemies and complications that would plague them for years to come. The buried treasure that would later become the subject of so much speculation and legend represented not achievement, but failure, a reminder of how quickly success could turn to disaster when circumstances beyond their control intervened. The psychological impact of the Blackwater massacre on the surviving gang members was perhaps more significant than the physical injuries and material losses they had sustained, as the operation had shattered their confidence in Dutch's leadership and their faith in their ability to operate successfully in a world that was rapidly changing around them. The massacre had demonstrated that they were no longer operating in the relatively simple environment of frontier law enforcement, but had entered into conflict with professional agencies whose resources and capabilities far exceeded anything they had previously encountered. More fundamentally, the killing of Heidi McCourt had violated the moral code that had provided justification for their criminal activities and bound them together as a community dedicated to something more noble than simple banditry and theft. The transformation of Dutch van der Linde from a charismatic leader who opposed injustice into a man capable of murdering innocent women created doubts and divisions within the gang that would never be fully resolved, even among those who remained loyal to him through the trials that lay ahead. As the surviving members of the van der Linde gang rode hard toward the mountains with the sound of pursuing hoofbeats echoing behind them and the acrid smell of gunpowder still clinging to their clothes, they carried with them not the triumph they had expected, but the bitter knowledge that their golden years were over and that the future held only the kind of desperate fugitive existence that they had always sought to avoid through careful planning and superior execution of their criminal enterprises. The Blackwater massacre had lasted only a few hours from beginning to end, but its consequences would reverberate through the remainder of their lives, transforming a successful criminal organization into a collection of hunted refugees whose survival would depend upon their ability to adapt to circumstances that none of them had anticipated or prepared for during their confident planning. Sessions in the camp outside town. The flight from Blackwater began in the kind of desperate haste that leaves no time for careful planning or consideration of alternatives, as Dutch van der Linde and the surviving members of his gang found themselves transformed in a matter of hours from confident criminals executing a carefully planned operation into hunted fugitives whose very survival depended upon their ability to stay ahead of the massive law enforcement response that was already mobilizing to pursue them. The sound of gunfire was still echoing through the streets of the town when they reached their horses and began the headlong rush toward whatever safety the wilderness might provide for men who had suddenly discovered that their reputation and skills were insufficient protection against the kind of professional opposition they had awakened. The decision to abandon the stolen money was made in those first crucial moments of their escape, when Dutch realized that the weight and bulk of $150,000 in currency would slow their movement to the point where capture would be virtually inevitable. The irony of this necessity was not lost on any of the gang members who had risked everything for that money, but survival took precedence over profit when federal agents and local law enforcement were converging on their position from multiple directions with the clear intention of ending their criminal careers permanently. Dutch's choice of hiding place for the abandoned treasure was made hastily, but with enough forethought to ensure that the money could potentially be recovered at some future time when circumstances allowed for a safer return to the Pateswime Blackwater area. The location he selected was known only to himself and perhaps Micah Bell, a decision that reflected both the chaos of their situation and Dutch's instinctive need to maintain control over resources that might determine the gang's future survival and success. The psychological impact of leaving behind such a substantial sum was perhaps even more devastating than the immediate physical dangers they faced during their escape, as the abandoned money represented not merely lost wealth, but the failure of their most ambitious criminal enterprise and the collapse of dreams that had sustained them through years of hardship and danger. The gang members who had participated in the ferry robbery found themselves fleeing not only from law enforcement, but from the recognition that their golden years as successful outlaws were definitively over. Davy Calendar's condition became increasingly alarming as they put distance between themselves and their pursuers. The bullet wound in his abdomen, causing internal bleeding that no amount of field medicine could adequately address. His pale complexion and labored breathing served as constant reminders of the human cost of their failed operation, while his obvious pain created additional stress for companions who were already struggling to cope with the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen them. The care that Davy received during their flight demonstrated the deep bonds of loyalty and affection that held the gang together, even in their darkest moments, as gang members took turns supporting him in his saddle and sharing their limited medical supplies despite the additional risks that such attention created for their own safety. His suffering became a shared burden that reinforced their sense of family and mutual obligation, even as everything else in their world seemed to be falling apart around them. John Marston's arm wound, while less serious than Davy's abdominal injury, created its own complications during their escape, as the bleeding and pain made it difficult for him to maintain his grip on his reins while controlling his horse through the difficult terrain they were traversing. The sight of blood soaking through his shirt served as a visible reminder of how close they had all come to death or capture, while his obvious discomfort added to the general atmosphere of suffering and desperation that characterized their flight. The route they chose for their escape took them eastward toward the Grizzly Mountains, following paths that Dutch and Hosea had scouted during their earlier travels through the region, but that were treacherous enough to discourage casual pursuit by law enforcement officers who lacked intimate knowledge of the terrain. The decision to head into the mountains rather than toward the open plains reflected both tactical wisdom and desperate necessity, as the high country offered concealment and defensive positions that might allow them to evade capture, even if they could not outrun their pursuers indefinitely. Arthur Morgan and Hosea Matthews, who had been conducting their real estate scam in another part of Blackwater when the ferry robbery began, found themselves caught in the spreading chaos as law enforcement agencies locked down the entire town and began systematic searches for anyone connected to the Van der Linde gang. Their own escape from Blackwater was complicated by the need to avoid detection while making their way to the predetermined rendezvous point where they hoped to rejoin Dutch and the others who had participated in the ferry robbery. The reunion between the two groups occurred several hours after the initial escape from Blackwater, in a remote canyon where they had previously established an emergency meeting place for exactly this type of situation. Arthur's first sight of the wounded and demoralized gang members who had participated in the ferry robbery told him everything he needed to know about how badly their ambitious operation had failed, while Hosea's immediate focus on Davy's medical condition reflected both his practical nature and his deep affection for all the gang members who looked to him as a father figure. The news of Jenny Kirk's death struck both Arthur and Hosea with particular force, as they had been fond of the young woman who had brought such sweetness and innocence to their rough community of outlaws and outcasts. Her loss represented not merely the death of a friend, but the destruction of something pure and hopeful that had helped to justify their belief that they were creating something better than the corrupt society they had rejected. The uncertainty surrounding the fates of Matt Callender and Sean Maguire created additional anxiety for gang members who were already struggling to process the magnitude of their losses and the implications of their changed circumstances. The possibility that their missing friends were dead was almost easier to contemplate than the likelihood that they had been captured alive and might be subjected to interrogation that could compromise the safety of the surviving gang members. Dutch's account of the events at the ferry was delivered in the kind of defensive and abbreviated manner that suggested his awareness of how badly he had failed in his responsibilities as the gang's leader, though his natural charisma and silver tongue still retained enough power to maintain the loyalty of most gang members despite the obvious catastrophe that had resulted from following his judgment. His description of the killing of Heidi McCourt was particularly painful to deliver and receive, as it represented a crossing of moral boundaries that contradicted everything the gang had previously stood for. The practical challenges of caring for wounded gang members while evading pursuit in increasingly difficult terrain created a series of crises that tested both their survival skills and their commitment to the principle that no gang member would be abandoned regardless of the personal costs involved. Davy's deteriorating condition made a rapid movement impossible, while John's wounded arm limited his ability to contribute to the tasks of camp security and resource gathering that were essential to their continued survival. The weather that had seemed favorable during their initial escape from Blackwater began to deteriorate as they climbed higher into the mountains, with gathering clouds suggesting the approach of a storm system that could either provide concealment from their pursuers or trap them in conditions that would test their endurance beyond its limits. The dropping temperature and increasing wind served as reminders that they were entering an environment where exposure and hypothermia could kill them just as efficiently as federal bullets. Their first night as fugitives was spent in a hastily constructed shelter that provided minimal protection from the elements, while offering clear sightlines that would allow them to detect any approaching law enforcement agencies before they could be surrounded and captured. The combination of physical discomfort, emotional trauma, and constant vigilance created an atmosphere of shared misery that nonetheless reinforced the bonds that held them together as a family of choice rather than blood. The conversations that occurred around their meager campfire that first night revealed the depth of the psychological wounds that the Blackwater massacre had inflicted on every gang member who had survived the experience. Dutch's attempts to maintain morale and unity were complicated by his obvious guilt over the decisions that had led to their current predicament, while other gang members struggled to reconcile their continued loyalty to him with their recognition that his judgment had failed them when they needed it most. Micah Bell's behavior during these discussions was particularly noteworthy for what it revealed about his character and priorities, as he showed little apparent remorse for his role in encouraging the ferry robbery, while focusing primarily on the practical challenges of evading capture and recovering the abandoned money. His coldness in the face of their losses and his apparent indifference to the suffering of wounded gang members created additional tension within a group that was already struggling to maintain its cohesion. The second day of their flight brought them higher into the mountains, where the terrain became increasingly treacherous and the vegetation sparse enough to provide little concealment from aerial observation if their pursuers had access to balloon reconnaissance or other advanced surveillance techniques. The physical demands of the journey were taking an obvious toll on all the gang members, but particularly on Davy, whose wound was showing signs of infection despite their best efforts to keep it clean and bandaged. The decision to seek shelter rather than continuing their flight was forced upon them by a combination of factors that included Davy's deteriorating condition, the exhaustion of both men and horses, and the approach of weather conditions that threatened to make travel through the high mountain passes impossible until the storm had passed. The abandoned mining town they discovered offered exactly the kind of refuge they needed, with sturdy buildings that could provide protection from the elements and defensive positions that would allow them to hold off attackers if they were discovered by law enforcement agencies. The mining town of Coulter had clearly been abandoned for several years, its empty buildings and rusted equipment serving as monuments to the boom and bust cycle that characterized so much of frontier economic development. The site of this ghost town, nestled in a high mountain valley, provided a melancholy backdrop for the gang's own recognition that their days of prosperity and success were also drawing to a close, transformed by circumstances beyond their control into something that belonged more to history than to the present moment. The blizzard that struck the mountains during their second night in Coulter was the kind of weather event that could trap travelers for days or weeks, with winds strong enough to knock a man from his feet and snowfall heavy enough to make navigation impossible even for those familiar with the terrain. Yet this same storm that threatened their survival also provided perfect concealment from any law enforcement agencies that might be attempting to track them, creating a natural barrier that was more effective than any human defenses they could have constructed. Davy Calendar's death occurred during the height of the blizzard, as his infected wound finally proved beyond the limited medical capabilities available to the gang in their mountain refuge. His passing was both a release from suffering and a devastating loss for companions who had shared years of dangerous adventures and developed the kind of deep affection that comes from mutual dependence in life-threatening situations. The burial they gave him in the frozen ground outside Coulter was conducted with the kind of dignity and respect that honored both his memory and their shared values as a community. The impact of Davy's death on gang morale was profound and lasting, as it represented not merely the loss of a beloved friend, but confirmation that their world was truly ending, and that the family they had built together was being destroyed by forces beyond their ability to control or resist. The grief that followed his burial was complicated by practical concerns about their own survival and uncertainty about what would happen to them if they were captured by the federal agents who were certainly still pursuing them despite the weather conditions. Dutch's speech following Davy's burial was one of his most important attempts to maintain gang unity and morale in the face of almost overwhelming adversity, as he sought to honor their fallen friend while providing hope and direction for the survivors who looked to him for leadership, despite the failures that had brought them to this desperate situation. His words carried echoes of the philosophical framework that had once justified their criminal activities, though they were now tinged with the recognition that their idealistic vision of creating an alternative society had been shattered along with their operational security and financial resources. The weeks that followed their arrival in Coulter were characterized by a strange combination of enforced inactivity and constant tension, as the blizzard conditions that protected them from pursuit also trapped them in circumstances where every day brought new challenges to their physical and psychological endurance. The limited food supplies they had been able to carry during their escape were quickly exhausted, forcing them to rely on hunting and foraging in conditions that made such activities extremely difficult and dangerous. Arthur Morgan's emergence as a practical leader during this crisis reflected both his natural competence and the subtle shift in gang dynamics that was occurring, as Dutch's authority was undermined by the recognition of his failures in planning and executing the ferry robbery. Arthur's willingness to take on the most dangerous tasks of hunting and reconnaissance demonstrated the kind of selfless dedication that had always characterized his relationship with the gang, while his success in keeping them fed and secure reinforced his position as someone whose judgment could be trusted even when other leaders had failed them. The psychological atmosphere within their mountain refuge grew increasingly complex as the weeks passed, and it became clear that they would be trapped in Coulter until spring weather made travel through the mountain passes possible once again. The combination of grief, guilt, uncertainty, and enforced intimacy created tensions and conflicts that tested every relationship within the gang, while also providing opportunities for healing and renewed commitment to their shared survival. As winter tightened its grip on the mountains and the gang settled into what would become months of exile from the world they had known, the full implications of the Blackwater massacre began to emerge in ways that would fundamentally alter not only their immediate circumstances, but their entire understanding of who they were and what their future might hold in a world that had demonstrated its ability to destroy their dreams and punish their ambitions with swift and terrible efficiency. While the Van der Linde gang endured their harsh winter exile in the abandoned mining town of Coulter, the consequences of their failed ferry robbery continued to reverberate throughout the region, like ripples spreading across a disturbed pond, creating waves of disruption that would fundamentally alter the political and economic landscape of West Elizabeth for years to come. The immediate response to what newspapers would soon christen the Blackwater massacre was swift and comprehensive, as federal authorities mobilized resources on a scale that reflected both the magnitude of the crime and the determination of powerful interests to ensure that such challenges to their authority would not be repeated or tolerated. Agent Andrew Milton of the Pinkerton Detective Agency arrived in Blackwater within hours of the ferry robbery, bringing with him not only additional personnel and equipment, but also the kind of systematic approach to criminal investigation that represented the cutting edge of law enforcement methodology in the closing years of the 19th century. Milton was a man whose professional reputation had been built upon his success in dismantling organized criminal enterprises through a combination of superior resources, scientific methodology, and relentless pursuit that wore down even the most sophisticated opponents through sheer persistence and overwhelming force. The lockdown that Milton imposed upon Blackwater was comprehensive and immediate, transforming the bustling commercial center into something resembling a military occupation zone where no one could enter or leave without submitting to thorough searches and detailed questioning by federal agents who had been trained to detect deception and extract information from reluctant witnesses. The economic impact of these measures was severe and immediate, as legitimate businesses found themselves unable to conduct normal operations while their customers and suppliers were subjected to interrogation procedures that many found intrusive and intimidating. Local merchants and business owners who had previously welcomed the growth and prosperity that federal investment in the region's infrastructure had brought began to question whether the benefits of civilization were worth the costs of the security measures that seemed to accompany it. The sight of armed federal agents patrolling streets where children had played and families had conducted their daily business created an atmosphere of fear and resentment that would linger long after the immediate crisis had passed, and normal commerce had been restored. The search for the missing gang members and the stolen money became an obsession for Milton and his subordinates, who understood that their professional reputations and career advancement depended upon their ability to bring Dutch van der Linde and his associates to justice while recovering the $150,000 that had been taken from the ferry. The systematic nature of their investigation left no stone unturned, as they interviewed every resident of Blackwater who might have observed suspicious activity and examined every building that could potentially serve as a hiding place for either fugitives or stolen currency. The discovery that the money had been cached somewhere in or near Blackwater, rather than carried away during the gang's escape, created additional complications for both the investigators and the local population, as federal agents expanded their search to include private residences, business establishments, and even church properties in their determination to locate the hidden treasure. The intrusive nature of these searches created friction between federal authorities and local residents, who felt that their rights and privacy were being violated in service of interests that had little to do with their own welfare and security. Citizens who had initially supported the law enforcement response to the ferry robbery began to express increasing resentment as the searches dragged on for weeks without producing either the missing money or significant leads regarding the whereabouts of the fugitive gang members. The disruption to normal life became a source of genuine hardship for working families whose livelihoods depended upon the smooth functioning of commerce and transportation systems that remained paralyzed by the ongoing investigation. The capture and interrogation of Mac Callender provided Milton with his first significant breakthrough in the case, though the information extracted from the wounded gang member came at a cost that reflected the ruthless efficiency with which federal agents approached their duties. Mac had been discovered hiding in an abandoned building on the outskirts of Blackwater, his condition already critical from the gunshot wound he had sustained during the ferry robbery, and the infection that had set in during the days he had spent without medical attention. Milton's decision to interrogate Mac, despite his obviously deteriorating physical condition, demonstrated the priority that federal authorities placed on gathering intelligence about the Vanderlinde gang's operations and future plans, even when such information came at the expense of basic humanitarian considerations. The agent's methodology involved a careful balance between providing just enough medical attention to keep his prisoner conscious and coherent while withholding the kind of comprehensive treatment that might have saved his life if other priorities had not taken precedence. The information that Mac provided during his final hours included details about the gang's organizational structure, their previous criminal activities, and their relationships with various contacts throughout the region who had provided intelligence, supplies, or safe haven during their years of operation. This intelligence proved invaluable for expanding the investigation beyond the immediate perpetrators of the ferry robbery, to include the broader network of accomplices and sympathizers who had made the gang's success possible. Milton's decision to end Mac's suffering with a mercy killing, after extracting all available information, was presented as an act of compassion, though it also served the practical purpose of eliminating a witness whose testimony might have complicated future prosecutions if he had survived to stand trial. The agent's clinical approach to this execution reflected the professional detachment that characterized his entire approach to law enforcement, where human lives were valued primarily for their utility in advancing larger strategic objectives. The psychological impact of Mac's death on his surviving gang members would not become apparent until months later, when they learned of his fate through sources that confirmed their worst fears about what capture by federal agents would mean for any of them who fell into Pinkerton custody. The knowledge that their friend had died slowly and painfully while being systematically tortured for information added another layer of bitterness to their resentment against the authorities who pursued them and reinforced their resentment, determination to avoid capture at any cost. The economic consequences of the Blackwater lockdown extended far beyond the immediate disruption to local commerce, as the isolation of such an important transportation and banking center created ripple effects throughout the regional economy that affected communities hundreds of miles away. Farmers who depended upon Blackwater's banks for agricultural loans found themselves unable to access credit during crucial planting seasons, while merchants, who relied upon the town's transportation hub to move their goods to distant markets, discovered that their entire business models had been rendered obsolete overnight. The human cost of these economic disruptions was particularly severe for working-class families who lacked the financial resources to weather extended periods of unemployment or reduced income while waiting for normal economic activity to resume. Children went hungry while their parents sought alternative employment that often required them to relocate to distant communities where opportunities might be more readily available, creating a refugee population within the very region that was supposedly being protected by federal law enforcement activities. Small business owners who had invested their life savings in enterprises that depended upon Blackwater's continued growth and prosperity found themselves facing bankruptcy as customers disappeared and suppliers became unable or unwilling to deliver goods through the federal security cordons that surrounded the town. The American dream of individual economic advancement through hard work and entrepreneurship seemed to be crumbling before the eyes of people who had believed that their cooperation with legitimate authority would be rewarded with stability and opportunity. Local law enforcement officials found themselves caught between their loyalty to the communities they served and their obligations to cooperate with federal authorities whose methods and priorities often seemed to conflict with local interests and values. Sheriffs and deputies who had spent years building relationships with the people they protected were suddenly required to treat those same citizens as potential criminals, whose every action and statement required suspicious scrutiny. The tension between local and federal law enforcement created additional complications for the investigation, as community members who might have been willing to provide information to trusted local officials were reluctant to cooperate with federal agents, whose aggressive methods and outside origins made them seem more like occupying forces than legitimate protectors of public safety. This resistance was particularly evident among immigrant communities and other marginalized populations who had learned to view government authority with suspicion and fear. The bounty hunters who descended upon the region in response to the substantial rewards offered for information leading to the capture of Dutch van der Linde and his associates created another layer of chaos and danger for innocent residents who found themselves subjected to scrutiny and harassment by armed men whose only qualifications were their willingness to use violence in pursuit of profit. These mercenaries operated with minimal oversight or accountability, creating situations where personal vendettas and simple greed were disguised as legitimate law enforcement activities. The presence of so many armed strangers in the community created an atmosphere of constant tension and potential violence that made normal social interactions fraught with uncertainty and danger. Residents who had previously felt secure in their daily routines found themselves looking over their shoulders and questioning the motives of every unfamiliar face they encountered, while children were warned to avoid contact with strangers whose intentions could not be trusted or verified. Sean Maguire's capture by bounty hunters represented one of the few bright spots in an otherwise bleak situation for those seeking justice in the wake of the ferry robbery, though the circumstances of his detention raised troubling questions about the methods being employed by those who claimed to be serving the cause of law and order. The bounty hunters who had taken Sean prisoner were more interested in maximizing their profit than in ensuring that justice was served, creating a situation where their captive became a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder rather than a criminal suspect who deserved due process under law. The negotiation over Sean's fate involved complex discussions between federal agents, local law enforcement, and the bounty hunters who controlled access to a valuable source of intelligence about the van der Linde gang's operations and future plans. The eventual decision to transport Sean to a federal prison rather than allowing him to be interrogated locally reflected Milton's determination to maintain control over all aspects of the investigation, even when such control came at the expense of efficiency or local cooperation. The news of Sean's capture and impending transfer to federal custody created additional anxiety for the surviving gang members who remained in hiding, as they understood that their friends' knowledge of their past activities and current circumstances could provide federal agents with exactly the kind of intelligence needed to track them down and bring them to justice. The possibility of mounting a rescue operation was discussed but ultimately rejected as too dangerous given their reduced numbers and limited resources. The gradual emergence of details about the ferry robbery's casualties and consequences created a narrative that would haunt Dutch van der Linde for the remainder of his life, as newspaper accounts and official reports documented not only the theft of money, but the death of innocent civilians who had been caught in the crossfire between criminals and law enforcement. The story of Heidi McCourt's murder became a particular focus of public attention, as her status as a young mother transformed her from an anonymous victim into a symbol of the human cost of criminal violence. The circulation of Heidi's photograph in newspapers throughout the region served to personalize the consequences of the gang's actions, in ways that made it impossible for even their most devoted supporters to dismiss the ferry robbery as a victimless crime against corrupt institutions. The sight of her orphaned children and grieving husband created a powerful emotional response that undermined whatever sympathy the gang might have enjoyed among community members who had previously viewed them as romantic figures fighting against an unjust system. The transformation of public opinion regarding Dutch van der Linde and his followers was swift and comprehensive, as former admirers found themselves forced to confront the gap between the idealized version of outlaw life that they had embraced and the brutal reality of violence directed against innocent people. The philosophical justifications that had previously made the gang's criminal activities seem acceptable or even admirable suddenly appeared hollow and self-serving when measured against the concrete suffering of real victims, whose only crime had been being in the wrong place when desperate men made fatal decisions. Local newspapers that had once portrayed the van der Linde gang in relatively sympathetic terms now competed to publish the most damning accounts of their crimes and the most detailed descriptions of the suffering they had caused to innocent victims. Editorial writers who had previously criticized the excesses of corporate power and government authority now called for swift and severe punishment for criminals whose actions threatened the basic security that civilized society required to function effectively. The political ramifications of the Blackwater massacre extended beyond West Elizabeth to influence policy discussions in Washington and other centers of federal power, as politicians and bureaucrats sought to demonstrate their commitment to law and order through increased funding for agencies like the Pinkerton Detective Service and enhanced penalties for crimes against interstate commerce. The ferry robbery became a symbol of the challenges facing American civilization as it sought to extend its authority over territories that had previously been governed by informal arrangements and local customs. The militarization of law enforcement that followed the Blackwater massacre represented a significant shift in the relationship between federal authority and local communities, as agencies that had previously operated with minimal oversight or coordination suddenly found themselves equipped with resources and powers that transformed them into quasi-military organizations capable of imposing their will through force rather than persuasion. This transformation would have lasting consequences for the development of American law enforcement methodology and the relationship between citizens and their government. The legacy of the Blackwater massacre would continue to influence regional politics and economics for decades after the immediate crisis had passed, as communities throughout West Elizabeth struggled to balance their desire for security and prosperity with their commitment to the individual freedoms and local autonomy that had originally drawn settlers to the frontier. The events of that fateful day had demonstrated that the old ways of life were ending whether people wanted them to or not, and that the future would belong to those who could adapt to the new realities of organized authority and systematic law enforcement that were rapidly replacing the informal arrangements of the frontier era. The years that followed the Blackwater massacre witnessed a transformation of that catastrophic event from immediate crisis into enduring legend, as the passage of time allowed the raw wounds of violence and loss to be gradually overlaid with the kind of mythological interpretation that the American frontier seemed to demand of its most dramatic and significant moments. The story of Dutch van der Linde's failed ferry robbery became a tale that was told and retold in countless variations throughout the saloons and general stores of West Elizabeth, each retelling adding new details and embellishments that reflected the storyteller's own understanding of what the events meant and why they continued to matter to people who had never met any of the participants, but who recognized, in their struggle, something fundamental about the changing nature of American society. The immediate aftermath of the massacre had been characterized by fear, anger, and a desperate desire for swift justice that would restore the sense of security that had been shattered by the outbreak of violence in what had seemed like a peaceful and prosperous community. Yet as months turned to years, and the immediate danger receded into memory, the residents of Blackwater and the surrounding region began to process their experiences through the lens of broader historical and cultural narratives that gave meaning to events that had initially seemed senseless and inexplicable. For some, the Blackwater massacre represented the inevitable triumph of civilization over chaos, the moment when the forces of law and order had finally demonstrated their ability to protect innocent citizens from the predations of violent criminals who had terrorized the frontier for too long. From this perspective, Dutch van der Linde and his followers were nothing more than common thieves whose romantic reputation had been exposed as fraudulent by their willingness to murder innocent women and children in pursuit of money that did not belong to them. Yet for others, particularly those who had experienced the harsh methods employed by federal agents during the investigation and lockdown that followed the robbery, the massacre represented something darker and more troubling about the direction that American society was taking as it evolved from a collection of autonomous frontier communities into a centralized nation-state controlled by distant bureaucrats and corporate interests. These individuals saw in Dutch's failed rebellion not criminal behavior, but a doomed attempt to preserve values and ways of life that were being systematically destroyed by forces that cared nothing for individual freedom or local autonomy. The economic disruption caused by the federal lockdown had created lasting resentment among business owners and working families who felt that they had been treated as criminals despite their complete innocence of any wrongdoing. Their lives and livelihoods sacrificed to serve the interests of banks and railroad companies that they had never chosen to support or oppose. The sight of their community occupied by armed federal agents had provided a preview of what the future might hold for people who found themselves on the wrong side of increasingly powerful government and corporate authorities. The mysterious disappearance of the $150,000 that had been stolen during the ferry robbery became a source of endless speculation and treasure-hunting activity that would continue for decades after the immediate crisis had passed. The knowledge that such a substantial sum was hidden somewhere in or near Blackwater attracted fortune seekers from throughout the region, creating a secondary economy of sorts as entrepreneurs provided supplies and services to amateur prospectors who were convinced that they possessed the key to locating Dutch's buried treasure. Local residents who had grown up hearing stories about the massacre often found themselves drawn into this ongoing treasure hunt, spending their spare time exploring abandoned buildings, searching remote caves, and digging holes in locations where local folklore suggested the money might have been concealed. The search for Dutch's gold became a kind of regional obsession that provided both entertainment and hope for people whose lives had been disrupted by economic changes that seemed to offer little opportunity for individual advancement or security. The psychological appeal of the treasure hunt extended beyond simple greed to encompass deeper longings for the kind of sudden transformation that finding the hidden money would represent. In an era when traditional paths to prosperity seemed increasingly blocked by corporate monopolies and government regulations, the possibility of stumbling upon a fortune that would provide instant freedom from economic anxiety offered a fantasy of liberation that sustained people through difficult periods when legitimate opportunities were scarce. Children who had been born after the massacre grew up playing games based on romanticized versions of the events, dividing themselves into gangs of outlaws and lawmen, while reenacting battles that bore little resemblance to the actual violence that had traumatized their parents' generation. These games reflected the natural tendency of young imaginations to transform historical events into adventure stories that emphasized excitement and heroism, while minimizing the suffering and loss that had characterized the real experiences of those who had lived through the crisis. The educational impact of these childhood games was complex and sometimes troubling, as they often presented Dutch van der Linde and his followers as romantic figures whose criminal activities were justified by their opposition to corrupt authority, while portraying federal agents and local law enforcement as villains whose primary motivation was the oppression of innocent people. Such interpretations reflected broader cultural tensions about the role of government in American society, but they also demonstrated how quickly historical events could be transformed into myths that served contemporary political and emotional needs rather than preserving accurate understanding of what had actually occurred. Teachers and parents who attempted to provide more balanced and historically accurate accounts of the Blackwater massacre often found themselves competing against cultural narratives that were more emotionally satisfying and dramatically compelling than the complex reality of events that had involved both heroism and cowardice, justice and injustice on multiple sides of the conflict. The transformation of history into legend was not simply a matter of inaccurate information, but reflected deeper human needs for stories that provided clear moral guidance and emotional catharsis. The various witnesses to the massacre who survived the immediate violence and its aftermath found themselves in the position of living repositories of historical knowledge whose memories and testimonies would be sought out by journalists, historiens, and casual inquirers for decades after the events had concluded. Yet these witnesses often discovered that their actual experiences were less interesting to most people than the mythologized versions that had developed in popular culture, creating a strange situation where those who had been present during the crisis found themselves arguing against their own elevated status as authorities on events that seemed to belong more to legend than to personal memory. Jimmy Brooks represented one of the most intriguing categories of massacre witnesses, a man whose presence in Blackwater during the ferry robbery was confirmed by multiple sources, but whose actual role in the events remained mysteriously unclear. Brooks claimed to have observed the robbery and its immediate aftermath from a position that would have provided him with detailed knowledge of the participants and their actions. Yet his accounts of what he had seen were often contradictory and seemed to change depending upon his audience and their apparent interests. The inconsistencies in Brooks's testimony might have been attributed to the natural unreliability of human memory under traumatic circumstances, but there were aspects of his behavior and knowledge that suggested something more complex and potentially significant than simple confusion or self-aggrandizement. His apparent familiarity with details about the gang's operations that would not have been visible to a casual observer, combined with his nervous behavior when questioned closely about his experiences, created suspicions that his involvement in the events might have been more substantial than he was willing to admit. The possibility that Jimmy Brooks had been an informant or accomplice whose testimony was being concealed for reasons related to ongoing law enforcement investigations added another layer of mystery to events that were already shrouded in uncertainty and conflicting accounts. His sudden disappearances from Blackwater whenever federal agents arrived to conduct interviews, followed by his equally sudden reappearances after they had departed, created a pattern of behavior that suggested either guilty knowledge or fear of consequences that went beyond ordinary concerns about legal testimony. The connection between Jimmy Brooks and the enigmatic figure known only as the Strange Man represented one of the most intriguing aspects of the folklore that developed around the Blackwater massacre, though the nature of this connection remained a matter of speculation rather than documented fact. The Strange Man had been observed in Blackwater both before and after the ferry robbery, his presence noted by witnesses who remembered him primarily because of his unusual appearance and behavior, rather than any specific actions that might have connected him to the criminal activities that occurred there. Descriptions of the Strange Man varied significantly among different witnesses, though most agreed that he was a well-dressed gentleman whose manner and bearing suggested education and sophistication, despite his apparent lack of visible means of support or clear purpose for being in a frontier community like Blackwater. His ability to appear and disappear without explanation, combined with his apparent knowledge of events that he should not have had access to, created an aura of mystery that made him a natural subject for the kind of supernatural speculation that frontier communities often attach to unexplained phenomena. The theological interpretations that some residents applied to the Strange Man's presence reflected broader attempts to understand the massacre in terms of divine judgment or cosmic justice, with the ferry robbery serving as either punishment for the community's sins or a test of faith that would ultimately lead to spiritual purification. These religious frameworks provided comfort to people who struggled to make sense of violence that seemed to serve no comprehensible human purpose, while threatening the basic assumptions about safety and morality that made civilized life possible. The Strange Man's apparent omnipresence during moments of crisis and moral decision-making suggested to some observers that he might represent a supernatural force that was either testing human character or recording human actions for some future reckoning. This interpretation transformed the Blackwater massacre from a simple criminal event into a cosmic drama where the choices made by ordinary people carried significance that extended far beyond their immediate consequences for the individuals involved. The philosophical implications of viewing the massacre through such supernatural lenses raised profound questions about free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of justice that resonated with broader cultural anxieties about the direction of American society and the apparent decline of traditional values in the face of rapid industrialization and urbanization. If the Strange Man was indeed some form of divine or cosmic observer, then the events in Blackwater took on meaning as indicators of humanity's spiritual condition, rather than simply as examples of criminal behavior and law enforcement response. The impact of the Blackwater massacre on regional literature and folklore was substantial and enduring, as writers and storytellers found in the events a rich source of material that could be adapted to serve various narrative purposes, while providing entertainment that resonated with audiences who had been affected, either directly or indirectly by the crisis. Dime novels and newspaper serializations that featured thinly disguised versions of Dutch van der Linde and his gang became popular throughout the frontier, their romanticized accounts of outlaw life providing escapist fantasy for readers whose own lives were constrained by economic necessity and social convention. The moral complexity that characterized the actual events of the massacre was often simplified in these popular narratives into clear conflicts between good and evil that provided the kind of emotional satisfaction that audiences sought from entertainment while avoiding the troubling ambiguities that made the real story difficult to process and understand. Dutch van der Linde might be portrayed as either a noble rebel fighting against corruption or a dangerous criminal whose charm concealed murderous intentions, depending upon the political sympathies of the author and the expectations of the intended audience. The feminine perspective on the massacre was often marginalized or distorted in these popular accounts, which typically focused on the actions of male participants, while treating women as either innocent victims deserving protection or dangerous temptresses whose influence led men astray from the paths of righteousness. The actual experiences of women like Abigail Roberts, who had lived through the crisis as members of the gang, or civilian women like Heidi McCourt, who had died as a result of the violence, were reduced to stereotypical roles that served narrative convenience rather than historical accuracy. The economic consequences of the massacre continued to reverberate through the region's development for years after the immediate crisis had passed, as the disruption of banking and transportation systems created lasting changes in commercial patterns that affected communities throughout West Elizabeth. Blackwater's growth as a regional center was permanently altered by the federal response to the robbery, as businesses and residents who had fled during the lockdown often chose to relocate permanently rather than risk experiencing similar disruptions in the future. The demographic changes that resulted from this economic disruption included not only the departure of established residents, but also the arrival of new populations who were attracted by opportunities created by the crisis itself. Federal agents, bounty hunters, and various entrepreneurs who specialized in serving law enforcement personnel brought money and activity to the region, though their presence also created social tensions that reflected broader conflicts between local values and outside authority. The long-term political ramifications of the massacre included significant changes in the relationship between local and federal law enforcement agencies, as the success of Agent Milton's investigation demonstrated the advantages of centralized authority and professional methodology over the informal arrangements that had previously characterized frontier justice. Local sheriffs and territorial marshals found their autonomy and authority increasingly constrained by federal oversight and standardized procedures that left little room for the kind of personal discretion that had traditionally characterized law enforcement in frontier communities. The institutionalization of law enforcement that followed the massacre represented a significant step in the transformation of the American frontier, from a region where individual initiative and local customs provided the primary sources of social order into a fully integrated part of a national system where standardized procedures and centralized authority took precedence over community preferences and traditional practices. This transformation was welcomed by some as evidence of progress and civilization, while others mourned it as the death of the freedom and independence that had originally drawn them to frontier life. The psychological legacy of the Blackwater massacre extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence an entire generation of frontier residents who had witnessed the sudden collapse of assumptions about safety, justice, and community that had previously seemed unshakable. The recognition that violence could erupt without warning in even the most peaceful and prosperous communities created lasting anxiety that manifested itself in increased security measures, heightened suspicion of strangers, and reduced willingness to take the kinds of risks that had previously characterized frontier entrepreneurship and social interaction. As the years passed, and the immediate trauma of the massacre receded into historical memory, the events of that fateful day in Blackwater continued to serve as a touchstone for broader debates about the direction of American society and the costs of the progress that was transforming the frontier into something that bore little resemblance to the free and open society that had originally attracted settlers to the West. The story of Dutch van der Linde's failed rebellion became a symbol of both the dreams and the nightmares that characterized the closing of the frontier era, a reminder that the forces of change were as capable of destroying what was valuable about the old ways as they were of creating opportunities that had never existed before. The true measure of any catastrophic event lies not in the immediate destruction it wreaks, but in the slow revelation of the forces that made such destruction inevitable. And in this regard, the Blackwater massacre stands as a perfect specimen of how ambition unchecked by wisdom, loyalty corrupted by manipulation, and idealism perverted by desperation can transform even the most noble intentions into instruments of tragedy and loss. The careful examination of what went wrong during that fateful ferry robbery reveals a web of causation so complex and interconnected that it becomes impossible to assign responsibility to any single decision or individual, though certain patterns emerge with the clarity that only hindsight can provide. The fundamental flaw in Dutch van der Linde's approach to the ferry robbery lay not in any single tactical miscalculation, but in his gradual abandonment of the collaborative decision-making process that had sustained his gang through years of successful criminal operations. The democratic traditions that had previously ensured that all major decisions were subjected to thorough debate and critical analysis from multiple perspectives had been eroded by Dutch's increasing reliance on Micah Bell's counsel and his corresponding diminishment of the influence wielded by more experienced and cautious voices like Hosea Matthews and Arthur Morgan. This shift in leadership dynamics reflected deeper psychological changes within Dutch himself, as the pressures of maintaining his gang's cohesion and effectiveness in an increasingly hostile environment began to take their toll on a man whose natural charisma and intellectual sophistication had always masked underlying insecurities about his ability to provide for those who depended upon him. The approaching end of the frontier era created existential anxieties that Dutch was perhaps not entirely conscious of. Fears that his way of life and the values it represented were becoming obsolete in a world increasingly dominated by corporate power and federal authority. Micah Bell's influence over Dutch was particularly insidious because it played upon these deeper psychological vulnerabilities while appearing to offer solutions that aligned with Dutch's own philosophical inclinations, emotional needs. Where Hosea might have counseled caution and patience, waiting for better opportunities to present themselves under more favorable circumstances, Micah encouraged the kind of bold action that appealed to Dutch's self-image as a visionary leader who could achieve great things through superior planning and execution. The tragedy of this influence was that it came at precisely the moment when Dutch most needed the kind of restraint and wisdom that his older advisors could have provided, as the gang found themselves operating in an environment where their traditional advantages were being systematically eliminated by technological and institutional changes that they were ill-equipped to understand or counter. The Pinkerton Detective Agency represented a quantum leap in law enforcement capability that required entirely new approaches to criminal planning and execution. Yet Dutch's response was to attempt ever more ambitious operations, rather than adapting to the changed circumstances. Micah's true motivations during this period remain a subject of speculation and debate among those who study the history of the van der Linde gang, though the evidence suggests a complex mixture of self-interest, opportunism, and perhaps even deliberate sabotage that reflected his fundamental lack of genuine loyalty to the community that had accepted him as a member. His encouragement of increasingly risky operations may have been motivated by nothing more sophisticated than his assessment that Dutch's gang was doomed regardless of what actions they took, making it logical for him to position himself to benefit from whatever opportunities their downfall might create. The possibility that Micah was already in communication with federal authorities during the planning stages of the ferry robbery cannot be definitively proven, but remains consistent with his later behavior and the remarkably effective countermeasures that law enforcement agencies deployed against the gang's operation. The timing and coordination of the Pinkerton response to the ferry robbery suggested advanced knowledge of the gang's intentions that could only have come from someone with intimate access to their planning discussions. Whether or not Micah was actively betraying the gang during this period, his influence upon Dutch's decision-making process was clearly detrimental to their collective interests and safety. His consistent advocacy for higher-risk operations that promised greater immediate rewards, while dismissing concerns about long-term consequences, reflected either remarkably poor judgment or a deliberate strategy designed to engineer the gang's destruction from within while positioning himself to survive and profit from the resulting chaos. The intelligence failures that contributed to the ferry robbery's catastrophic outcome reflected broader problems with the gang's information-gathering capabilities and their assessment of the threats they faced in an increasingly sophisticated law enforcement environment. Their reconnaissance of Blackwater had focused primarily on identifying opportunities while paying insufficient attention to the defensive measures and response capabilities that federal agencies could deploy against anyone who threatened their interests in the region. The gang's traditional sources of intelligence were proving inadequate for operations conducted in communities that had achieved the kind of size and importance that attracted federal attention and resources. Where they had previously been able to rely on sympathetic local residents and corrupted officials to provide advance warning of law enforcement activities, they now found themselves operating in an environment where professional investigators had the resources and authority to maintain operational security that prevented advanced knowledge of their plans from leaking to potential targets. Agent Andrew Milton's investigation and pursuit of the Van der Linde gang represented the cutting edge of federal law enforcement methodology, employing systematic approaches to intelligence gathering, criminal psychology, and resource deployment that gave government agencies decisive advantages over even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. Milton's success in setting the trap that destroyed the gang's operational effectiveness demonstrated the futility of trying to oppose federal authority through traditional outlaw tactics that had been developed for a very different kind of conflict. The psychological warfare that Milton employed against the gang was perhaps even more effective than his direct law enforcement activities, as his ability to penetrate their security through informants and surveillance created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that undermined the trust and cooperation that were essential to their survival as a criminal organization. The knowledge that they were being systematically hunted by professionals with unlimited resources and legal authority created stress that affected every aspect of their decision-making process. The interrogation and execution of Matt Callender provided Milton with crucial intelligence about the gang's operations, while also serving as a demonstration of what capture would mean for any of the remaining members who fell into federal custody. The message was clear and unmistakable. Surrender would not lead to fair trial and imprisonment, but to torture and death at the hands of agents who viewed them not as criminals deserving due process, but as enemies of the state, whose elimination was a matter of national security. This escalation in the stakes of their conflict with federal authority transformed what had previously been a criminal enterprise, with manageable risks, into a life-or-death struggle, where capture meant certain death, and continued resistance offered the only hope of survival. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating for gang members, who had never previously contemplated the possibility that their criminal activities might lead to torture and execution rather than simply imprisonment or exile. The human cost of the Blackwater massacre extended far beyond the immediate participants to encompass the innocent civilians who became casualties of violence that they had no role in creating or sustaining. Heidi McCourt's murder represented the most tragic and inexcusable aspect of the entire affair. The killing of a young mother whose only crime was being in the wrong place when desperate men made decisions that violated every moral principle they had previously claimed to uphold. The psychological trauma inflicted upon Heidi's surviving family members created ripple effects that would influence their lives for decades after the immediate crisis had passed. As her husband struggled to raise their children alone while dealing with grief and rage that could never be adequately addressed through legal proceedings or financial compensation. The knowledge that their loved one had died as a result of criminal violence that served no comprehensible purpose created a legacy of bitterness that would be passed down through generations. The broader community impact of civilian casualties extended beyond individual grief to encompass collective trauma that undermined faith in the basic security and predictability that made civilized life possible. The recognition that violence could erupt without warning in even the most peaceful and prosperous communities created lasting anxiety that manifested itself in increased security measures and reduced willingness to trust strangers or take risks that had previously seemed acceptable. Dutch van der Linde's transformation from idealistic leader to desperate criminal capable of murdering innocent women represented one of the most tragic aspects of the entire affair, as it demonstrated how quickly moral principles could be abandoned when survival seemed to require actions that contradicted everything a person had previously stood for. The killing of Heidi McCourt marked the moment when Dutch crossed a line that separated principled rebellion from mere criminal violence, destroying not only an innocent life, but also the philosophical framework that had provided justification for years of criminal activity. The psychological impact of this moral collapse on Dutch himself was evident in his increasingly erratic behavior and paranoid thinking in the years that followed the massacre, as he struggled to reconcile his actions with his self-image as a principled opponent of corruption and injustice. The cognitive dissonance created by this contradiction between ideals and reality gradually undermined his mental stability and his ability to provide effective leadership for the gang members who continued to depend upon him for guidance and protection. The gang's internal dynamics were permanently altered by the events in Blackwater, as the shared trauma and guilt created divisions and resentments that could never be fully healed. Despite the bonds of loyalty and affection that continued to hold most members together, the knowledge that Dutch was capable of murdering innocent people under pressure created doubts about his judgment and character that influenced every subsequent decision and operation, while the loss of Jenny Kirk, Matt Callender, and Davy Callender created grief that served as a constant reminder of the costs of following Dutch's leadership. Arthur Morgan's gradual emergence as the gang's de facto leader reflected both Dutch's declining capability and the other members' recognition that survival required more practical and cautious approaches to criminal planning than Dutch seemed capable of providing. Arthur's natural competence and moral compass made him a more reliable guide through the challenges they faced, though his loyalty to Dutch prevented him from challenging the older man's authority directly, even when such challenges might have served everyone's interests. The seeds of the gang's ultimate destruction were planted during the Blackwater massacre, not only through the immediate losses they sustained, but through the precedent it established for decision-making processes that prioritized short-term gains over long-term security and survival. The pattern of increasingly desperate operations conducted with insufficient planning and inadequate consideration of risks would be repeated throughout the gang's final years, each failure making the next desperate gamble seem more necessary and justified. The economic consequences of losing the $150,000 they had stolen from the ferry created practical pressures that influenced every subsequent decision the gang made, as the need for money to support their fugitive lifestyle led them to accept operations that they might have rejected under different circumstances. The buried treasure that remained hidden near Blackwater became both a source of hope and a constant temptation that diverted resources and attention from more practical approaches to their survival needs. The psychological significance of the abandoned money extended beyond its practical value to represent the failure of Dutch's grandest ambitions and his inability to provide for the people who had trusted him with their lives and futures. The knowledge that financial security lay buried within reach but remained inaccessible because of the law enforcement presence that made return impossible served as a constant reminder of opportunities lost and dreams deferred. The broader historical significance of the Blackwater massacre lay in its demonstration of how quickly the old ways of frontier life were being swept away by forces that represented not simply different approaches to law and order, but entirely different concepts of what American society should become. The conflict between Dutch's gang and federal law enforcement was not simply a matter of criminals versus police, but reflected deeper tensions between individual freedom and collective security, between local autonomy and centralized authority, between traditional values and modern efficiency. The victory of federal authority over the Van der Linde gang represented a crucial step in the transformation of the American West, from a region where informal arrangements and personal relationships provided the primary sources of social order into a fully integrated part of a national system, where standardized procedures and institutional authority took precedence over community preferences and individual initiative. This transformation was historically necessary and probably inevitable, but it came at the cost of values and ways of life that had genuine merit and that would be mourned by those who had experienced their benefits firsthand. The legacy of the Blackwater massacre would continue to influence American culture and politics for generations after the immediate participants had passed into history, as the story of Dutch van der Linde's failed rebellion became a symbol for broader debates about the costs and benefits of progress, the relationship between individual rights and collective security, and the question of whether the values that had built American civilization could survive the processes of modernization and centralization that seemed necessary for its continued development. In the end, the Blackwater massacre stands as a perfect microcosm of the forces that were reshaping American society at the turn of the 20th century, a moment when the dreams and nightmares of the frontier era collided with the realities of industrial capitalism and federal authority to produce tragedy that was both deeply personal and historically inevitable. The price of Dutch's ambition was paid not only by those who followed him into disaster, but by an entire way of life that died with them, leaving behind only memories and legends to remind future generations of what had been lost when the old world gave way to the new. And so, our tale of the Blackwater massacre draws to its melancholy close, like the last notes of a campfire song fading into the vast frontier night that stretches endlessly across the American West, carrying with it the dreams and sorrows of those who dared to live by their own rules in a world that was rapidly running out of room for such independence. What began as Dutch van der Linde's grand vision of one final score that would secure his gang's future became instead the nightmare that would haunt his followers until their dying days, transforming them from successful outlaws into desperate fugitives whose every breath was purchased with the blood of innocence and the betrayal of principles they had once held sacred. The $150,000 they had sought with such determination and hope became blood money that none of them could ever touch, buried somewhere in the environs of Blackwater, like a curse made manifest in gold and silver, payment for sins that could never be washed away by any amount of penance or regret. The treasure that was meant to buy their freedom became instead a monument to their failure, a reminder that some prices are too high to pay and some lines too dangerous to cross, even for men who had already placed themselves beyond the pale of civilized society. The ferry that should have carried them to prosperity became instead their chariot to destruction, bearing them not toward the promised land of California and independence, but toward the frozen peaks of the Grizzly Mountains, where they would spend the darkest winter of their lives, learning the true cost of ambition unchecked by wisdom. The blood that was spilled on Blackwater's docks that day would stain everything that followed, transforming their brotherhood from a family bound by shared ideals into a collection of damaged souls held together by nothing more substantial than guilt and the recognition that they had nowhere else to go. Dutch van der Linde himself was perhaps the greatest casualty of the massacre, though he would live for years afterward carrying the weight of what he had done and what he had failed to prevent. The man who had once inspired loyalty through his vision of a better world became someone who could murder innocent women when his back was to the wall, crossing moral boundaries that separated principled rebellion from mere criminal violence, and destroying not only lives, but the philosophical framework that had given meaning to their dangerous way of life. The transformation of Dutch from charismatic leader to desperate fugitive stands as testament to how quickly idealism can be corrupted by circumstances that strip away pretense and reveal the essential character that lies beneath our finest aspirations and most noble intentions. The silver-tongued philosopher who had preached about justice and freedom became a man capable of using a young mother as a human shield, demonstrating that moral principles are only as strong as the courage required to uphold them when survival seems to demand their abandonment. Micah Bell's role in engineering this catastrophe remains shrouded in mystery and speculation, though his subsequent actions would reveal a capacity for manipulation and betrayal that suggests his influence over Dutch may have been more calculated and destructive than anyone realized at the time. Whether he was already working for the federal authorities who would eventually claim him as their agent, or whether he simply recognized an opportunity to position himself advantageously while his companions destroyed themselves, his encouragement of the ferry robbery represented a turning point that would doom everyone who trusted him. The innocent victims of the massacre, people like Heidi McCourt, who died simply because they were in the wrong place when desperate men made fatal decisions, serve as reminders that the romantic mythology surrounding outlaw life often obscures the brutal reality of violence directed against those who had no part in creating the circumstances that led to their suffering. Their deaths were not noble sacrifices in service of some higher cause, but senseless tragedies that accomplished nothing except the destruction of families and the creation of grief that would echo through generations. Jenny Kirk, Mac Callender, and Davy Callender paid with their lives for their loyalty to Dutch van der Linde and his vision of freedom, though their deaths purchased nothing more valuable than the knowledge that some dreams are too costly to pursue and some leaders too flawed to follow into the darkness that awaits those who mistake desperation for courage. Their sacrifice stands as testimony to the bonds of loyalty and affection that held the gang together, even as everything else in their world was falling apart, demonstrating that love and friendship can endure even when the causes that originally brought people together have been revealed as hollow and destructive. The law enforcement officers who pursued the gang with such relentless determination were not merely doing their jobs, but were serving as instruments of historical forces that were transforming the American frontier from a region where individual initiative and local customs provided the primary sources of social order into a fully integrated part of a national system where federal authority and corporate interests took precedence over community preferences and traditional values. Their victory over Dutch's gang represented not simply the triumph of good over evil, but the inevitable success of organized efficiency over romantic individualism. Agent Andrew Milton and his fellow Pinkerton operatives demonstrated that the old ways of frontier law enforcement were as obsolete as the outlaw gangs they were designed to combat, bringing professional methodology and unlimited resources to bear against criminals whose tactics and strategies had been developed for a very different kind of conflict. Their systematic approach to investigation and pursuit made the gang's eventual destruction virtually inevitable, regardless of how skilled or determined their quarry might have been. The communities that were disrupted by the massacre and its aftermath learned painful lessons about the costs of progress and the prices that must be paid when old ways of life give way to new forms of organization and authority. The residents of Blackwater who experienced federal lockdown and systematic searches discovered that the benefits of civilization came with corresponding obligations to submit to forms of control that their frontier ancestors would have found intolerable, while the economic disruption that followed the crisis demonstrated how vulnerable even prosperous communities could be to forces beyond their control. The children who would grow up hearing stories about Dutch van der Linde and his gang would inherit both the legends that transformed criminal violence into romantic adventure and the reality of consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect entire communities and regions. Their games and stories would preserve distorted versions of events that served contemporary needs for heroes and villains, while obscuring the complex moral and political questions that the massacre had raised about the direction of American society. The treasure that remains buried somewhere near Blackwater continues to symbolize both the dreams that motivated the gang's criminal activities and the ultimate futility of trying to purchase freedom through violence and theft. Those who still search for Dutch's gold are seeking not simply money, but vindication of the belief that individual initiative and bold action can triumph over institutional power and systematic oppression. Though the history of the massacre suggests that such beliefs may be as illusory as the treasure itself, as you drift towards sleep on this quiet evening, let your mind release the tensions and conflicts that have filled our story, allowing the violence and betrayal to fade into the past where they belong while holding on to the gentler truths that emerge from even the darkest tales of human failing and redemption. Remember that even in the bleakest moments of the frontier, when hope seemed as distant as the stars that shone over the grisly mountains, there were still acts of courage and kindness that demonstrated the enduring power of love and loyalty to transcend circumstances that might otherwise destroy the human spirit. Think not of Dutch van der Linde's failures and crimes, but of the vision that originally inspired him to seek something better than the world he had inherited, even if his methods proved tragically flawed and his judgment fatally compromised by pride and desperation. Remember Hosea Matthews not as a man who failed to prevent catastrophe, but as someone whose wisdom and gentleness provided a moral center that sustained his companions through trials that would have broken lesser souls, demonstrating that true leadership lies not in commanding others, but in serving as an example of what humanity can achieve at its best. Consider Arthur Morgan not as a criminal whose loyalty led him into violence and exile, but as a man whose fundamental decency remained intact despite the corrupting influences that surrounded him, proving that moral character can endure even in circumstances that seem designed to destroy everything noble and worthwhile about human nature. His commitment to protecting those he considered family, regardless of the personal costs involved, stands as testament to values that transcend the particular circumstances that shaped his life and choices. Let the wind that blows across the Great Plains carry away the bitterness and regret that mark the final years of the Van der Linde gang, leaving behind only the recognition that their story was ultimately about people who sought freedom and belonging in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to both aspirations. Their failures were human failures, born of the same needs and desires that motivate all of us, while their occasional successes demonstrated possibilities for loyalty and courage that remain available to anyone willing to embrace them despite the risks they entail. Rest now in the knowledge that even the darkest chapters of our history contain lessons about resilience and redemption that can guide us toward better choices and more hopeful futures. While the mistakes of the past serve not as condemnations, but as warnings that can help us avoid repeating the tragedies that have marked every generation's struggle to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility. The legend of Dutch van der Linde and the Blackwater massacre will endure not because it celebrates violence and criminality, but because it reminds us that the price of our dreams must always be weighed against the cost to others, and that true freedom can never be purchased with blood, money, or built upon foundations of betrayal and innocent suffering. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that the morning will bring new opportunities to choose wisdom over ambition, compassion over self-interest, and hope over despair. While the stories of the past whisper their gentle warnings and encouragements across the vast American landscape where dreams and nightmares have always walked hand in hand beneath skies that have witnessed both the best and worst that humanity has to offer the world,